hopefully we go live and everything's good. We'll wait like 3 minutes for like people to get in here, right? Mm-hmm. We're about 10 minutes behind. That's okay.
Pretty normal.
Not bad, actually.
Not that bad.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah. Not for me at least.
No.
Sometimes I was saying like, yeah, I'll be on at like 1, guys, and I'm on at like 3.
Yeah.
Like 2 hours late.
Accurate.
Yeah.
So. 10 minutes is pretty good.
I'm used to running streams for like work now, where it's like you must be exactly on time.
Yeah.
There's like
Right.
you can't be late on anything. It's like a super bad thing. Okay. So are we live? You guys seeing it?
I'm not.
Yep.
You're not seeing it.
Are you seeing it?
I see it.
Yeah, I'm in the chat.
All right.
Oh.
Nice.
Okay, yeah. It looks live to me.
Oh, there we are. Okay, I see us.
No,
There we
Okay.
let me.
I don't have multiple displays for this setup I have here. There's just one. I'm usually used to having like 3 displays where I can have chat over here, I can have stream over here, I can have watch a bunch of different stuff, and I can't do that this time. So I basically just got you guys up here.
Okay. Yeah.
But it is live, right?
It is.
Live.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm tweeting it out to
Great.
all my people.
Go ahead and send out your links if you feel so inclined. We'll wait until, what time is it right now? We'll wait until 5:45 to begin. It is 5:41, so like 3.5 minutes.
Well, that's great because I actually have to plug in my computer.
Good idea. Very good idea. For those of you joining us, this is not what our usual podcast setup is like. We usually have a studio and like a whole like actual legit setup, and the internet went down in the building. Actually, we couldn't record
Like
last
a week
week either.
ago.
I know they still haven't fixed. I don't think it's for the whole building. It must not be, because if everybody was complaining, they would have fixed it. So it must just be our studio space is down right now. But they were supposed to have it fixed, and they don't. So I'm going to be calling and yelling at some people tomorrow.
Mike's ire.
I'm pissed. I'm pissed, dude. Especially because we're going to need to be recording again later in the week, so we better have it ready by then. Anyway, that's why we're set up like this. Just a good old Discord.
Well, hey, I'm happy to be here,
Happy to have you, man. It's been... we had you the one time on the stream that we did, the release day stream. It wasn't really release day. It was 2 days before release day, but that was the idea. So good to have you on. Clark, Schrodingersbabyseal, and we've got Ryan, Night Sky Prince, and we got Wade, ProfNoctis. Thank you guys for taking the time. Especially Wade, I know that your schedule's crazy, so glad we were able to make it work out.
Man, I wanted to make it work. Like I'm so glad it has.
Me too. So how long do I need to set like a hard cutoff on this? Like what is like too ridiculously a long time for us to talk? What time do we need to end?
I'm good. However long it takes for me to win this argument.
For us all to submit.
We'll be here all night.
7:30 or maybe
7:30.
I mean, that would be an hour 45. I mean,
that was kind of what I was planning. It was about 7:30. So yeah,
that would be great.
We'll do.
I'm till whenever. So
okay. So you're not pressed. I know Wade is.
I bounced straight over into a stream after this, but that is flexible. So
okay.
Okay. Whatever needs to be done, let's do it.
Okay, we'll shoot for 7:30 Mountain Time here. So it's about an hour and a half, a little more than an hour and a half from now. All right.
If we get riled up though, like I'm in. Like I'll keep
You'll keep going.
7:30 soft.
We can throw down. We can throw down all night. Yeah, I'm down for an all-nighter on this.
Yeah, I made sure to eat and everything before this, so I'm good. I was really excited for this.
Yeah, I know. I just ate too. That's why I'm a little late.
Yeah, it's all good. Okay, does it look like we got activity? Sorry, I'm not seeing the chat. Like I said, this whole thing was kind of, I threw it together last second.
There's movement.
We got 151 watching, so we're...
Okay, I think we're good to go then.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I am also going to record this so that I can release the audio version. So I might as well hit start recording on that. There we go. And then I'll put the audio version up. That's the only thing I have to worry about this week. All right, fellas, you ready?
I just had this genius idea. I was like, wait, what if there was a streaming service, but it was only audio? And that's radio. So I'm about 100 years behind on that one.
Yeah.
I was close.
Welcome back, everyone, to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name is Kason.
It's Kason, and we are joined today for our final episode of our Final Fantasy XVI analysis by three other great YouTube channels you've probably heard of.
Yep.
We've got Ryan from the Night Sky Prince here with us, Clark, Schrodingersbabyseal, and, of course, Wade, ProfNoctis, also here with us. I'd like to pass the time over to each of you real quick. Ryan, people pretty much know who you are, so I'm not too worried about that. But for the other two, this is kind of our first time having you guys on for a discussion like this. So tell us a little bit about your channels, what you do, and why you love Final Fantasy so much. I'll start with Clark, I guess.
Well, I'm Clark, and my YouTube channel, Schrodingersbabyseal, is a hilarious quantum physics joke. You'll just have to take my word for it. I mainly do deep analysis. I'm sort of, not to be a cliche, but 7 focused. So I've been, covering Remake and Rebirth extensively, and all of the side hustles that 7 does too. The compilation,
it's quite a few.
Crisis, etc. Yeah, I mean, I was even doing First Soldier streams.
Yeah.
But,
Can't anymore, though.
Can't anymore. Waiting for the second Soldier. But I have a background in mythology and religion, much like our other guests, and so I generally bring that level of granular analysis to my breakdowns of everything Final Fantasy. I'm certainly, even though my content is generally focused around 7, and I have sort of an encyclopedic knowledge, heavily pushed Shinra Archaeology Department, who does real fresh translations of interviews as obscure as you can imagine, stuff nobody else has. So definitely check out their site. Also, I have played every Final Fantasy pretty extensively, and I am kind of shifting into a more general content and actually moving into FGC stuff. Although I don't know how much analysis I'll bring to Devil Jin, but I'm going to be smashing fools with him. So yeah, that's generally what I do, and it's going to be a real big next 5 months for my community and channel. So please
Certainly
subscribe.
Real quick, I see a lot of people in chat saying that Mike's audio is a lot louder than everyone else's.
I can fix that.
It said, someone said, Mike loud, everyone else too quiet.
I can fix that. Hold on, fellas. I've also scooted back a little bit from my mic. I was probably just up on it a little too hot. How does that sound? Keep an eye on it. Let me know if they think it's better now. Okay. Hit us up, Wade. Tell us about yourself.
Sure. So my name's Wade. I am relatively new and kind of surprised to be in a group like this because I've loved Final Fantasy for years, but I guess where my YouTube channel, my Twitter, all of that, my Twitch stream, all that stuff comes from is because I did a dissertation on Final Fantasy XV and how to use that in education. And so I've spent 4 years playing Final Fantasy XV. So I'm no stranger to Final Fantasies that other people tend to revile, and I have a tendency to love those. So I teach a class at the University of Alabama called Judeo-Christian Kingship through Final Fantasy XV. It is a great, fun class. The students play the game. I live stream it and all that kind of stuff. And during COVID, actually, I had to go online, and that's when my Twitch channel started. And ever since then, I've kind of kept doing that. So my love for Final Fantasy began really with Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo. I guess Final Fantasy II for me in the U.S. And yeah, I've been a fan all ever since, I guess. The things that I love about Final Fantasy has always been the story, and we'll definitely get into that, I guess. So.
For sure. Real quick before I move on to Ryan, the two of you have a background in theology here. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Why did you decide to pursue that course? We'll go to Clark first.
I really did have a fascination in Jewish mysticism and Gnosticism because of Xenogears and Final Fantasy VII. Those two games did actually push me into a sort of outsider's fascination, and then once that became scholastic and scholarly, then I did the thing where I ruined my interest in those with overexposure.
Yep.
Yeah, of course.
Happens to the best of us.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Wade? Why did you pursue theology?
So for me, I grew up in Alabama, and I'm still in Alabama, and it is, the buckle of the Bible Belt, as we say. And so I grew up in churches and all that kind of stuff. But I was a gamer before I was a religious person. So I always say that I knew Mario before I knew Jesus, and so that kind of started everything for me. So when I played things like Xenogears and all that stuff, I was kind of reckoning with a critique of religion as well as a personal religion. And so I ended up getting 3 degrees in it to try to reckon with all of that, and here I am today.
How did that go? How do you feel
post-reckoning?
Post-reckoning.
It depends on who you talk to. I consider myself religious, but some of my peers are like, whoa. Especially my students. They're like, we're going to pray for you. I'm like, oh, okay.
Your religion no longer matches the orthodoxy. I got you.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
Both Mario and Jesus are most commonly depicted as Italian.
Right?
Most commonly, that's the key word there.
Most commonly.
Ben Starr has been doing voiceovers for everybody, including Mario. Maybe he can do Jesus.
Yeah, he probably can.
I would listen.
That's his next big role.
Yeah.
Ryan, hit us up, man. Give us the rundown.
Oh, right. Well, I'm Ryan, also known as the Night Sky Prince. I have been making Final Fantasy content since 2017. I started making content on Final Fantasy 15, kind of covering the post-release of FF15. Some people have some Mandela effect going on and think that they watched me leading up to 15. I actually started shortly after, like just a couple of months after. It's always interesting to hear that from people. But yeah, I've always been enthusiastic about Final Fantasy. And it's motivated me in a lot of ways too. I'm very thankful for it, for kind of shaping who I am, shaping my taste in video games, really creating this interest in story-driven games, right? Because I think whenever I tell people I'm a content creator for a living, their minds immediately go to Fortnite or Minecraft,
sure,
or something like that, right? And to hear that there is this entire world of story-driven games, and some of these games are as good as some of the best films that you'll ever watch, is pretty incredible. And I've always wanted more people to know about that, and I think that Final Fantasy has some really outstanding stories in it that I think more people should have exposure to.
Thank you very much.
You're here.
Totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here's the plan for today's stream, everybody. We've already finished Final Fantasy XVI. Everybody here has. We covered the ending on the podcast last week in the last episode. So essentially, today we're going to be talking we're not going to really doing any summary. We're going to be talking about themes. We're going to be talking about execution. We're going to be talking about just kind of the overall experience, where we're sitting on it now. I tried my best after last week, because people know that Case and I weren't necessarily so hot on the game by the end of it, to fill out a panel here of people who would have lots of different feelings and perspectives on this. Tried to make it as diverse as possible, because as hard as I tried to really carefully navigate articulating my feelings last week, to do it in a cordial way, to do it in an inviting way, in a warm way, like, hey guys, I wasn't so great on it, come on, like, just tell me what you think. I got suggested to be I needed intellectual guidance, so I've invited some intellectual guidance this week. You heard Clark at the beginning joking a little bit about getting ready to throw down and do some debate. I actually really wanted to do this in particular with content creators who have a lot of different opinions from ours, to show two things. One, the toxic discourse surrounding Final Fantasy is totally not necessary, and there can be, I think, a lot of room to, one, agree to disagree, which will probably happen on this podcast, but two, kind of get through to each other, to have like a real, actual, productive discourse. So that is something I really wanted to demonstrate with this. So that's option number one. Option number two, I think we're going to agree on a lot more than people are going to think we're going to agree on. They're thinking we're coming from these total opposite places, and it's really not the case. So anyway, I am really excited to have this conversation. I hope that the audience will appreciate everybody making the time, and I definitely appreciate you guys making the time and coming in to do this. So why don't we start here? Everybody already knows Kason and I's feelings. We did that last week, but why don't we go around and have everyone give us sort of their maybe paragraph or two overall sentiment or feeling on the game as a whole. How do you feel coming out on the other side? We'll start with Ryan, because you were especially, I think, very, very high writing in. So on the back end of that, where are you at?
Okay. Well, I titled my review on the game Excellence Meets Imperfection. And I think that in a lot of ways sums it up. There were a lot of moments in Final Fantasy XVI that were incredibly high moments. And am I allowed to go into spoilers now?
Yes, this is okay. I should have said that. This is a full spoiler. Go for it completely. Yeah, I think I need to raise the level on Kason real quick. Let me do that. Okay, he needs to be louder.
Oh, just me?
Yeah, I got you. Don't worry. Go ahead.
There are moments like when you're fighting Titan or Bahamut that are just out of this world. And I'm just like, this is the cool. True. Yeah, I'm like, this is the coolest thing ever. Moments that I would describe, spectacle wise, as some of the peak of like Final Fantasy, where I'm looking at it and I'm holding my controller, and my neck is going back and my pupils are dilating, and it's incredible. And then after that, I would have to go back and I'd be doing these very repetitive dry quests, and some of those quests had some really interesting stories behind them. But unfortunately, the way that you engaged with that was just so, to be frank, poor at times, and really uninteresting. And so, the whole time I'm playing this game, I'm going back and forth between, I really like this, and then I'm like, oh my God, how much longer can this drag on? And so I feel like the whole experience with the game was just really going between these polar opposite feelings. And I just wish that, game development is really complicated. If maybe making the game shorter would have resolved some of these issues so that they could have, really honed in on the parts of the game that felt dry, or if they would have, created maybe some systems that would have allowed for questing to be more interesting than what it was, right? Because it's really hard to do when the foundation of like your gameplay system is literally just, well, all you really have is fighting, basically, right? So it's really hard to, especially for a role-playing game, to make quests that are so insanely interesting every single time from a game design perspective, when your sort of kit as a game designer is basically been limited to basically a handful of interactions. So there was a lot that I liked about Final Fantasy XVI, but also I do have to be critical of it in quite a number of areas that I just think that just simply could have been better, in my opinion.
Okay. Why don't we move to Clark next?
Well, I somewhat agree. I think that most of if I were to write down all of my thoughts on the game, I would talk more about where it failed than it succeeded. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think that the game failed. I think the game was this may be more of a critique of the state of gaming, but I do think it is one of the best and most comprehensive stories told in a game in the last couple of years.
I see.
But that being said, I think that the execution of the game really did not serve all of the best elements of its story, of its lore, of its world building. The themes that were built up in this way on paper, like this, if Final Fantasy XVI were a novel, I think it would have encapsulated the theme of Final Fantasy, like the core of Final Fantasy, as a motif better than any of the other Final Fantasy stories. However, it worked so hard against the actual execution of the game. For a game, for instance, about like the power of friendship, and I recognize that all Final Fantasies are about rejection of isolation and the whole kill God motif, and depending on your friends. I mean, for the game to, on a story level, execute that so wonderfully on the only Final Fantasy where you don't have party members, just felt like such a misstep. And so much of the way that the game is designed feels like it just set itself to be the riskiest Final Fantasy and ends up being the safest one instead. And I went into this thinking, so excited that we were this is the heart of Final Fantasy for me. I watched Wade's video, and the heart of Final Fantasy is about taking these risks and setting these precedents, but instead it ended up really playing it very safe with almost every system, down to RPG elements, down to the action combat. I think that in a lot of ways it moved backwards, but where I ultimately left the game is that, and I replayed the ending right before this podcast, I do feel like it did stick the landing in the end for me. And I'll get into that later when we get more into it. But that's kind of my paragraph, like 5 paragraphs on it.
All good. All right. Wade, hit us up. What is your feeling on the game?
I started out with a 10 for the game. I came in hot, right? And the beginning section particularly, that prologue, moving into the Benedicta stuff, that stuff was just prime, somewhere in the middle, I'll use this intentionally, it became kind of mid, and I think she had a lot to do with that. To be perfectly honest, some of her main story quests. But I will say that every time I started to get a little iffy on the game, it would do something to draw me back out. usually an icon battle, or sometimes, bringing in a character that I really felt for, like Gav, right? Gav's growth and development, I really loved him as a sidekick. Would I have loved him as an actual party member? Absolutely. But he added some of that banter that I really liked, and some of that levity. By the ending, I'm kind of like Clark here. They stuck the landing so firmly for me, with the ending, that I immediately went to the library and to Barnes and Noble to do extra research, because I was like, there is something here. To me, the reason I love Final Fantasy XVI is because, as someone that has spent a great deal of his life studying religion, this is philosophy of religion 101. Here, all the way back from the Greeks and even before that. I particularly have studied ancient Near Eastern religions and myths, and this is the culmination of that for me. And so I'm looking at it from like, oh my gosh, the nuance and the little things that they were able to pick up on that help people reckon with not just this idea of free will. I actually think that it's a lot deeper than that. This idea of the relationship between humanity, reality, dogma, truth, and will in that. And to me, that was like, this game is saying something really, really important, even if I have to help people unpack it, which is why I'm doing a stream about it this semester. So, but for me, all that to say, it really, really worked, really, really clicked. I've got critiques of it. I am right there with Ryan and Clark when they're saying that the gameplay limits the game. It is a combat-focused game, and that is to its detriment. And then there are parts story-wise where, yes, it's the height of Game of Thrones, and it's also the last season of Game of Thrones as well. They kind of dropped the ball a little bit.
Okay.
That's actually a pretty good analogy.
Yeah. And I just want to chime in real quick too and say, with combat focused games, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. However, when you look at combat focused games, a lot of them are a lot shorter. And I think it is tremendously hard to make a game that is primarily focused on combat go on for 40 to 70 hours. Yeah. That tends to be where you run into issues with that. But if you do 20 and under, but also too, there's a lot of things in Elden Ring meta to combat that make Elden Ring interesting, particularly exploration, right? Which is one thing that say 16 doesn't have, right? So so
okay. So I'm a little First of all, a little surprised. I was expecting. I guess I'm not that surprised, but like I'm a little bit surprised that we didn't have one person on here who was like way up here on it, because that's kind of what I was hoping for at first. But I'm actually glad it went this way, because to me it's reflective of the fact that despite like some of the kickback we got last week, there seems to be in the majority of people I actually speak to, kind of a similar sentiment, a sentiment that like it starts off really strong and then it hits kind of this lull point, and then we have sort of a divide between people who really like the ending and people who don't like it.
Right.
So I think there's a lot more agreement on that than even I initially expected there to be. So that's really interesting to me. Now, speaking of the ending and the fact that two of you really felt like it landed and it worked, I would love to get your thoughts on that. I'd love to get your breakdown on it. So why don't we start again with Clark? Why don't you explain to us what you think about it made it work, made it land for you?
And I before I even really decided to give like a metric on the ending, I played through it twice. I got the platinum, and it wasn't until I got the platinum that I really like kind of just thought about the way that it was making me feel. For me, the most emotional scene, and this is the one that kind of separates me, like I have trouble. I was explaining to my wife what the last scene of the game was, the post-credit scene, and I got emotional explaining it, and it's hard for me to even describe why it's so good, but the post-credit scene where we get this kind of idea of what the game was all about, like the world that was built as a result of our actions. The ordinary magic, like as he blows into the flame, as the little boy blows into the flame and the Final Fantasy theme kicks in and he's creating magic through work. There's something about that that resonated with me so deeply and just really hit all the strings that were being plucked throughout the course of the story. That was really good. And then, for when the second time I beat it, I got that notification that I had gotten the platinum, and the platinum is called the Chronicler, and you are awarded the Chronicler. And the reason I found that so interesting in this meta sense is that for all the lack of ambiguity that this game has, it almost to a fault explains things. You sometimes doesn't leave a lot of negative space where I think negative space could have been used in the story. It has this ambiguous ending, and the value of that ambiguity was that the freedom that was created through the process of killing God landed in this way because we are handed the pen. We get to write the ending as we see it. It was like the one part of this game that was ambiguous, and for me that really landed emotionally. But from a philosophical and religious standpoint, the one of the main themes of all Final Fantasies, and it's this idea that gets turned into a trope. All JRPGs you kill God. Well, it's kind of like it's more of a motif of Final Fantasy. It's part of the series identity of Final Fantasy is that it's not really killing God, killing the demiurge or any of its Gnostic equivalents are it's really about a self-reflection. So what Ultima represented was this flawed, incomplete version, like an uninvolved version. So it was this unevolved reflection of ourselves, the nemesis to our narcissus. And how that relates to all the problems that the world has does sort of relate on this grand scale to the problems our actual world has, that the solution really is inside. And so to theatrically, present this self-battle, this battle against this, false idealized version of ourself, landed for me. And I don't want to take up all the time talking about it because I know that Professor Noctis has probably something similar to say, but that's kind of the crux for me of why the ending really landed is that, we're given this opportunity to write our own ending. And that it all seemed to make sense for me. It just clicked for me, all the things that we did to, break the boundaries of causality and freedom, just to create this ordinary world. How that was represented in Joshua's religion. When Joshua would praise his deity, he would say, "Thank the founder." And then if you look up what the founder is just this grassroots story about a guy that made a house on a hill. There's something just kind of beautifully representative of both the secular and faithful in that, and I thought that it was really socially sound for me.
Okay, there's a couple things I want to return to with that, but let's go over to Wade real quick. I'm excited to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so in a lot of my classes, I talk about this idea of mythos and logos, right? And the way that I bring it up is I start the class by asking the question, what do you know for sure? And we're going to get all kinds of answers, right? Especially for 18, 19, 20-year-olds. They're going to respond by saying, life is hard, or everything works out, or, mom's paycheck is great for me. So whatever it is. And then I ask a question of, so how do you know this? How did you come to that conclusion? And they're going to usually couch it in a story. Now, this is how I begin describing mythos and logos, right? And the stories undergird the practicality. They inform the logic behind the ways that we perceive the world, the ways that we interpret reality. What this game did, and I think that it did it so well in the ending, was it doesn't dissolve the mythos. Instead, it vivifies it. Clive embodies all of the mythos, all of the stories, and these stories there is a degree of truth that's greater than the fact of the supreme being, Ultima, right? They are the dominants can prime into what's called an icon, and an icon is essentially the image. It's an image of God. If you're going back to Greek and early, especially New Testament understandings of image of God, and even further back into Jewish and ancient Near Eastern, this idea of icon is the representation of the divine mystery. And what we see with all the dominants is that there is a failure or a flawed or an incompleteness to the way that they are representing the divine. And it's an incompletion that even Ultima has himself. We then see Clive as he's taking on all of these mythos, these different stories. He's embodying them by the end in a way that is pure, unfettered, in the way that it could be. And that is a direction of the will. So one of the things that really worked for me was that it is a culmination of mythos that moves into a logos that is will directed. Now, once we get to that final credit scene, I'm so glad that you brought that one up, Clark. I was like in tears because the mythos is contained to a book at this point. Right. And what are the kids doing? They're playing magic. They're playing who's going to be Bahamut, who's going to be Ifrit, who's going to be all of these characters, and they're fighting over who's going to be. And
they're engaged in logos.
They're engaged in it, right? And it's like, even though everything is settled, that sort of tension, that sort of conflict of reality and our part in reality, it continues. And it's as common as children fighting on a playground and stuff. And that says a lot about the philosophy of religion, our clinging to mythos, sometimes without logos, a story. I think of some of my colleagues and friends who hold on to like the creation museum stuff. This is a fundamental, literal sort of happening, but there's no real logos to that, right? There's no practicality. And then vice versa, when we just have practicality and rules, dogma, but there's no undergirding story to vivify it. Instead, you have this combination. I'll say this final piece. As soon as I heard Clive called mythos, I freaked out. And I told a friend of mine, I was like, I think they're going to bring out this idea of logos. And I was like, if they do, I think this is what's going to happen. It's going to have something to do with Joshua. I was like, I don't even know what's going on with Joshua. But when Ultima said, is this the power of logos? I screamed. Like, I threw my it was the moment for me. I was like, this game, 10 out of 10 for me. I don't know. That's how it stuck that landing for me.
So you're talking about the scene where
the
Clive is sort of he's sort of in and out of this sort of state. He's seeing visions of different characters in the game, and then like he's pulled out of that by Joshua in the end, and then Ultima's up there, and then he okay,
absolutely.
All right, Ryan.
Oh boy.
Anything you would like to add about your thoughts on the ending?
I echo a lot of the sentiments that Wade and Clark so beautifully said here, though there were some issues for me personally. I think the biggest issue was kind of that in part of the conclusion, that kind of the answer to the oppression of the bearers was kind of to make them the same as everyone else, and that kind of resolved their oppression. Oppression. Sorry.
I mean, they're definitely less depressed while dead. Yeah.
that was like the resolution for their oppression was to essentially make them the same as everyone else, and that was probably the most disappointing aspect of the ending to me, because I think that doesn't really reflect reality quite too well, right? Mm-hmm. As we're always going to have these sorts of differences, and so I kind of feel like if there was some way to make it so that the bearers would always be different, but that humanity would have to learn how to accept those differences within one another, I feel like that would have had a more powerful conclusion to me than to say humanity just can't deal with people being different. So we all need to be the same.
The same.
Yeah.
In order for oppression and discrimination and those sorts of things to end. And another thing too is kind of the power of friendship is something that people often say in a derogatory manner when talking about JRPGs. But let's be honest here. I think, at least in all the times that I've had that have been like the worst in my life, the power of my friends and my family is why I'm here, and why I enjoy and live life. So I think that a lot of times people use the power of friendship to be, condescending toward JRPGs. But if you can genuinely make people feel that their connections are what allow them to overcome adversity in life, I think that's really a powerful message. I think that the reason that got a bad rap for JRPGs is because a lot of JRPGs try to skip immediately toward, because we're friends, everything just works out. And but if you genuinely built that up in the right way and make someone feel that, I think that is the ultimate message to send to someone, because that's something that I think deeply resonates with most people. However, one of the things that kind of bothered me about the ending, and several points throughout 16, was kind of, you're telling a story that in a lot of ways is one of the most power of friendship Final Fantasies, and then we don't have any involvement from the rest of the party in that ending.
But there's a disconnect. It's like they didn't quite the story and the gameplay and everything didn't quite mesh together to tell us that.
Right, exactly, right? Because there was even the scene where, there's multiple scenes where Jill and Joshua, they're like, Clive, you can't do it alone.
Right.
And then we do it alone. And then we just do it alone, right? And even if there was, kind of a cliche moment where Clive is like, I have, Jill and Joshua like in my heart, and that's the reason I'm able to overcome this. That would have at least helped drive the message home. But there wasn't really anything there to kind of, make you connect that. And then also too, there was, this game didn't have party members in the traditional way, but considering that you have party members following you the whole time, really, you always have Jill around for the most part. Sometimes they separate for you, but it feels kind of contrived when they do separate from you. When I'm like, there's no reason for you to actually, not be here. The game just kind of wants you to not be there for some reason. And so I was fine with it just being Clive and it just being Clive's journey. But I think the story was not wrote in sync with that. And so
it wasn't a Clive's journey story.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was specifically not a Clive's journey story. Yeah. And so that moment, I mean, there were other times in the game, but that moment at the end specifically where, you're supposed to overcome, this adversity, and it's supposed to be specifically about him overcoming that through his connections that he's made. And then there's no involvement from them. And as much comparison as this game can get to Dragon Ball, I think even Dragon Ball can have moments where Goku's connections actually are why he's able to defeat the enemy, right? The Spirit Bomb with Majin Buu, right? Like everyone that Goku helped throughout his journey, right? It was made from, their spiritual energy, right? Even that was like, kind of a moment. And so I think that even that could have actually been helpful. Again, it sounds cliche on the surface, but I think there's a reason those types of tropes go along with these types of stories and messages for a good reason. So,
gotcha. Okay, I want to pass it over to Kaysen real quick. Do you have anything that has popped up amongst what's been said here? I just want to give you a chance to say if anything's come to you.
No, a ton of things are coming to me. I want to say them as people are talking, and I know this isn't really the way to do that on
One day
video chat.
we'll all be in a room together.
That would be awesome. That would be great. I have, well, maybe the best way that I can put it is somebody had mentioned before. I think it was you, Clark. You had mentioned something about how Clive had kind of embodied this new kind of thing that could get rid of Ultima as the uncaring god and replace it with something that was more sincere. Is that you had a different way of putting it, but I can't remember exactly what it was.
I think it was just that the conflict between Clive and Ultima had more to do with being a reflective. It was Narcissus looking into the pool and dismantling the vision of what we consider to be strong, what we consider to be strength, what is leverage, you know. So that was more the way I envision. Like it was almost necessary that Ultima not be characteristic, that he not have features. It was important that he be featureless, that you know, he was kind of this idealized self. Like that's, I mean, in Eastern philosophy, that's kind of the idea behind kill God, you know, in Buddhism. So it just it resonated.
What is that?
Really
There's
well
that famous proverb: if you ever see the Buddha, kill him, right?
Yeah.
But also, would that explain why Ultima kind of looks like a Greek statue?
I'm not here to just to comment on why they made Ultima not have eyelids or do any of the stuff that they did with him. I just think that they were like, hey, kind of creepy. You know, I think they just went
nose
with,
though, and I don't know. He's got a lot of Greco-Roman features. I think
there are some features
in a statue.
Yeah.
Another one, and I never really got this idea out there very well early on, but hearing you kind of talk about that kind of brought this idea back to the forefront of my mind, that Clive had an intuition that Ultima was not truly divine, right? Yeah. And that's in his moment with Harpocrates, you had that.
Yeah,
and the question, okay, go ahead.
And Joshua too. Joshua was very constantly like the aberration in the system. Like, you know, he would constantly show up as like Phoenix is not on the circle of Malleus. You know, he went off on his weird journey, and so he was sort of meant to. I mean, and you know, from a really kind of over the top, you know, Joshua being Yeshua, you know, which is Jesus, the name of Jesus. The Phoenix being, you know, rising again. You know, like Barnabas parting the seas. Like there's some really obvious symbols that they use to kind of represent that Joshua and was supposed to kind of be a component that breaks the system and generates salvation from, you know, this demiurge concept, which is very borrowed, but I think it goes, I think it worked a lot better than games that didn't have the space to tell that story. Even my favorites like Xenogears.
Well, I just wanted to throw this one out here then, that when Clive had the intuition that Ultima was not truly divine, that intuition itself is the voice of God. That Ultima is some, what would you call it? Some pagan Greek god version of God that thinks he's the ultimate God, but is not. As Clive, embodying the true Logos, is able to actually defeat Ultima, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think Wade's got this one.
I mean, I think you're exactly right. You know, one of the pieces that I teach in a lot of my classes is, especially I do one class on the Gospels and kingship, where we talk about the Gospel of John. And I think you mentioned in the last podcast that John chapter 1 talks of Jesus as the Word or the Logos, right? And a lot of people think that this is going to usurp, that this is the usurpation of all of the stories that have come from the past. But when you read Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, going into John, which is chronologically the way that they would have been written, you're seeing that Jesus as the Word, the Logos, is the fulfillment of that mythos, right?
That's the word.
In the Logos, you have the collection of all of the mythos, but not the dogmatic mythos. because the dogmatic mythos is where we got the holy wars that would be, our icon versus your icon, the Philistines, right? This is where we get that sacral divine war tension, which ultimately Jesus, as the Logos, doesn't seem particularly interested in. This is what I think is particularly interesting about this. You have so many different representations of dogmatic, legalistic, ritualized religious sects, from the Iron Kingdom to the Circle of Malleus, right? And each one of these represents a good piece, but also a flawed piece of this religiosity and a flawed piece of this understanding of the divine. And Clive comes with this truest form, this Logos, which brings, an end to Ultima, who is masquerading. I think that's particularly interesting. Yeah.
Very good. The way I would think of it, and this is beyond 30,000 foot view. This is like 50 billion thousand foot view. So please, this is very general, and nobody hate me on this. And I'm not talking to you guys. I'm talking to everyone else who's going to watch this. Yeah. If we look at the Old Testament as being mythos and the New Testament as being logos, right? And that you have them both. Right, that you have the logos, which is then used to interpret the mythos, and that's like the fulfillment, if that makes sense, right? So you don't get rid of the mythos, right? You don't, but by the same token, you can't just you cannot just survive on logos alone. Yeah. You need to have them both together, and I think that was as who is it, Saint Ambrose, convinced Augustine that the Old Testament's still important. You can't just get rid of it. You have to keep that as well as the New Testament, which is the Logos, anyways.
Right, which is really interesting. You bring up Augustine, or Augustine, who is bringing about. It's interesting because he is one of the first advocates that said we're going to look at these archetypal stories of Genesis and creation as literal. He was turning the mythos or the mythos into logos, and it's like you can't do that.
You're right, and then
together.
Yes, and that causes trouble later on down the line. Yeah,
right. Instead, they work in concert together, and that's what I love about the Clive and Joshua piece together.
Yeah, because it requires the two of them, right? Which is what Joshua kind of discovers there towards the end with the mural. Right. Okay, so we've talked here a lot about theme, sort of like more abstract concepts, but let's get a little bit into the execution of those things. So you're saying you're picking up these bits and pieces, and it's spiking or sparking, like excitement in you as you're hearing the terms logos and mythos in the game. How do you think that they did from a technical storytelling point at like actually foreshadowing and paying those concepts off? Why don't we start with Clark on that?
A little poorly, to be honest. I had to spend a lot of time in the ATL, the active time lore, to look at stuff. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big Elden Ring fan. I like sometimes having to work for my lore. I'm not suggesting that, but this wasn't presented necessarily as a game that was necessary to fully enjoy. And a casual observer isn't going to be able to watch the cutscenes of this game and really get all that. Like the context of Zemeckis and the children of Zemeckis, like the really potentially fascinating foil that Barnabas could have been for Clive when the amount of dialogue that they had was so limited, and there it does feel like this is something that, if novelized, where in a novel all of that context is necessarily going to be on print, it works. So I don't even know if who I would necessarily fault for the execution. I don't know if I'd fault Mayhero. I think that the bones of the story and even the dialogue itself is written pretty well. I also think too that some of the characterization was so heavily carried by the incredible performances in the game that sometimes we lose how bare some of the dialogue actually is. Like,
I am so happy you're saying this, because people were acting like I was a moron for saying this, And like these conversations between Clive and Barnabas, I really felt were just ankle deep in terms of like what they're actually getting into compared to the depth it could have gone. You know, there's way more to get into than they actually do.
All the context behind Barnabas. And, you know, I don't know if this was an issue where they had too many characters. You know, they spent a lot of time on side characters that had great resolutions. You know, we talk about Gav. Gav was a great character. If Gav weren't in the story, we might have had a villain that we understood. You know, we might have had, you know, a foil between, I mean, like the dramatic tension of parting the seas and then going and getting your ass handed to you by Barnabas, and then like he just calls you Muthus and then pieces out. I was like, wait, no, I just read the Active Time lore. Like I know that, you know, there's that your mother started this cult. I want to hear about that. I want to talk about that stuff, you know. But no, there's none of that. And so
DLC. They're saving up. It's tickling you. They're teasing you.
Yeah, I agree. So that my take was that there were some flaws in execution of a good story that came down to, and that and I, you know, I'm friends with Ben Starr. I find him to be an amazing guy, and I watch everything he does, and I've watched him talk about, and he's talked to me about like the way that he portrayed his character, and you talk to him and he put a lot of his own spin, like this is how, so a lot of the context that we feel like we hear is stuff that just like the actors came up with, and that's great from like a hearing it perspective, but like but then there's a disconnect between who's telling the story now. Like that's all of that context was given by an actor in the booth, not on paper, or not in this way.
There's nothing to back it up, right?
Exactly.
In the text itself.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
I'm curious to see if we'll all agree on this. This goes back to even FF13. It was one of the larger complaints about that game with its data logs, right? That like a majority of like necessary context to really get at some of the meat of what that story was about was relegated to those data logs. I really tend to dislike these kinds of whether it's active time lore or data logs or just like a database of stuff. There's very few examples, maybe like Mass Effect, where I really like it, but I think a lot of
presentation in Mass Effect is different.
Yes,
the presentation is a lot more engaging.
Yes, and
with this one, you're just going through like an encyclopedia or like a dictionary, you know, and it's like okay, it's hard to keep it all straight, and it's not encouraging to continue reading.
I feel like the inclusion of this sort of, database like this, where people can go to learn more about the story and get more context or learn more lore or whatever, can often be used as a crutch, where a lot of that stuff should be given through mandatory cutscenes and dialogue in the story. We had similar complaints about Final Fantasy VIII, where you play that game kind of just relying on the main cutscenes, and you miss ridiculous amounts of foreshadowing about that game's twist, which feels like it comes out of nowhere, when really it's right there from the very beginning of the game when you're sitting at the desk in the classroom. Like there's hints about that right there, but you don't get it in the main thread. And a lot of, I feel like this game relies on either doing all the side quests or reading the ATL, and I just really I don't appreciate when it's used as a crutch like that. What do other people feel in regards to how the ATL was used in this game? Anybody can go. I'm not going to keep picking who talks.
The only time that I like that kind of lore is Elden Ring, where it's like it's really a journey. Like you have to like read item descriptions and then go explore areas, like look at pictures and say, "Oh, I have to do the work of doing this," and it's its own kind of game. Like there's a mechanic to learning the story that in itself is a special kind of fun challenge. not a
Otherwise,
chore.
Otherwise, you won't get the story. Or at least to the extent that they've written it, and I think that that's an important designation. Like in 16 or in any Final Fantasy, you are being given a story, and so there's this idea that it's going to be complete. I mean, gosh, the 15 discourse was all about this, right? Mm-hmm. All of the elements of the story were there. Trust me on that. I researched it. But the idea behind it was that's not the best way of learning a story. That's bad storytelling in this particular medium. For Elden Ring, it's great.
Well, I think that the FromSoft games in particular, maybe this is even true a little bit of a game like BioShock, right? The story has already happened by the time you actually, in the timeline of the game world, by the time you start playing. You're discovering the aftermath of it, really. Right,
you're like there. Breath of the Wild, similar kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So you're going through and exploring and trying to piece together the puzzle of what happened here. Portal, very, very similar. So I think in that format that it works, like you're saying, but in something like this, where most of the story is given through like dialogue, like characters interacting with each other, more of like a cinematic experience than say an emergent one. It's really not where I prefer to see databases of this kind.
Mm-hmm. I'm noticing something else too as we bring up Breath of the Wild, Portal, and you mentioned Elden Ring. I can't remember who mentioned Elden Ring, but you have something of a game that stands on its own without you having to know any of the lore. Right. You just the gameplay and the exploration and the battle mechanics, that's enough. And for 90% of players, they don't need to do that. Final Fantasy XVI is a different case where this is more story driven, and it seems like things are hidden in that sense, that the game doesn't necessarily stand on its own just without the deeper story, if that makes sense.
Right. You almost put a lot of pressure on the story by default. By saying this is a story-first game, even over gameplay in all aspects. That means that you have to be pretty flawless about how you tell that story. Otherwise, the entire experience kind of falls apart as a result. And that's really tough to do.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You finish up real quick.
Yeah, I was just going to say one more thing regarding that, too. I think one of the difficulties I came across, too, with the story and the ATLs is that every time I felt like a mystery was teased, and like there's so many interesting things in this game that I wanted to just know more about. The ATLs actually didn't have it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hit or miss. It was hit or miss.
Right, and there were so many things, and as I watched your podcast series, I noticed that you guys came across a lot of the same frustrations where there was something really interesting, and I'm like, please tell me more about that thing, and the game's like, no. And
maybe
and that's
DLC.
Like maybe DLC, and I'm hopeful.
I hate hoping for that.
Ryan, was there something in particular? Was there one thing that stuck out to you where they would set something up and you really wanted to know that, and then there wasn't a payoff for it? What was that one thing for you that was like the most annoying?
I'm trying to think. There was like half a dozen. Like just in like the beginning. And Mike, I know you're going to relate to this because me and you we had the same thought going into this. What was with the out of body scene with Clive and like him seeing from Torgal's perspective, right? Yeah. What was that about? What was Media about?
They both. Well, it all kind of felt like a lot of these things were just red herrings. Like they were meant to divert your attention, or think that it's something else, and then it ended up. You know what I mean? Like
right, which is fine if
you can do it.
Yeah, if the mystery is even greater, right?
Exactly, I was going to say that.
Yeah. But if it's just that, then
it's like they passed up would have been a lot cooler for something that was less cool.
Why did Joshua not approach Clive much sooner? Like he's just watching him from the shadows go about doing what he's doing. And it plays us off as if he's suspicious of him or that there's some reason why he's not. And then it's just like, they meet up in Twinside after he's battled Bahamut, and it's okay, we can travel together now. Like, why?
Yeah. Well, and then also too, there's a really big one. Who is the hooded guy that Clive saw at the opening of the game?
Yes.
Like that's also still a big mystery to me too. Like I assume now that it's Ultima, but then why does Ultima then look like how Joshua looks
okay,
later
so
on?
there is kind of an answer to that though in the lore.
Is
Okay,
there?
so let's hear
Please,
it.
yeah.
It's
So-
in the ATL, you're saying?
Well, so in the reason is because the cult that saved Joshua, they have been a long-standing.
The Undying, right? Yeah.
The Undying have been a long-standing enemy of Ultima, and Ultima's best play at gaslighting them was to make his enemies look like Clive's enemies. So he emulated the robe of the Undying, which was what Joshua was wearing because he had joined the Undying after the Undying saved him. So that's why he chose that. Yeah. But
If this is the case,
yeah.
then why does the hooded guy show up at Drake's breath when Clive is not around? You know, he's there at the crystal in the Iron Kingdom, and then he's also there at Drake's Fang right before the Titan fight, and he's just kind of standing off like where no one could see him, and he's like doing some magic and manipulating stuff.
Yeah. Well,
why would Ultima take that form?
No, that's Joshua.
Joshua was at. You're saying he was at Drake's Fang?
Yeah.
The person who made Clive become Ifrit by like moving his hands, like Clive was like, "I want to be Ifrit," and then some hooded figure like snaps his fingers, and then Clive becomes Ifrit. That was Joshua?
Yes.
Whoa.
How do we know that? I'm not sure that I agree.
I don't know
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I just don't think that any of that there's any okay, let's say I'm wrong, and that those Undying hooded figures that we see with Joshua's faces, are still Ultima. The reason for gaslighting is the same. Like, you're driving Clive to fight his enemy, to fight Ultima's enemy. Right. And that is beneficial to Ultima. So, I mean, that still makes sense to me.
My assumption was that it was Ultima. I guess the confusion was why take that form. I don't even think anyone's actually observing him in those scenes. That's why it's weird if it's Ultima. If it's Joshua, it's weird too, because I at least I know for a fact in the scene at Drake's breath where they go to the Iron Kingdom, he's actually headed towards Twinside at the same time. He's not there. He's walking with what's her name?
Yote. Yeah.
They're on their way to Twinside, right on the back of that scene, sure. And he like senses, oh no, Ultima's reaching out towards Clive again. So at least that hooded figure for sure was not Joshua.
I could be wrong, but I do actually think that it's still going to be the same reason that it's an attempt to kind of turn Ultima's enemy against his enemy. I still think that's
to be suspicious of the Undying,
right?
To make Clive suspicious of them, because he definitely was.
He was, and I was too in turn.
Yeah, but to be clear, the execution of that, your criticism of the execution of that, and why is Joshua not just meeting up with Clive like immediately, absolutely requires an explanation. Like, I'm not defending that decision at all. It was done entirely for dramatic effect. So
right, for the player, not for the story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't been to Wade here in a second. I want to get your thoughts on some of this stuff. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a degree I can go with you, Clark, in the idea that there is an ambiguity to it. I mean, so much of this game is built on ambiguity. Instead, the hooded figure to me wasn't about who is this, but by the end, I'm seeing that it's a manipulation into coercing Clive to do Ultima's will. And so this tension that's rising in him, ultimately everything that he does to Clive is to break his will. And so the hooded figure is in the prologue particularly is a symbol of Ultima is present, and this is a moment that is testing Clive's resolve and Clive's will. And I think that every time that you see that, you're seeing another moment where Clive's will is being shattered to some degree, or at least assaulted. That's the way that I took that.
Okay.
Now, there were several moments where I was like, well, is that Joshua? Is it not? And I think that the ambiguity is part of it. You're supposed to think in terms of, like, Clive is as confused as you are, right? And it's creating some trauma for him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move off this for a second, because I want to talk a little bit about setups and payoffs with the Metia portion of this as the ambiguous part of the ending. Is there anybody here who's like on board? It landed the Metia setup and payoff. Where are our feelings on that?
Big nope. Big nope.
Okay, I'm not alone on this. Good. So nobody has a strong feeling for what they feel like they're certain they know what Metia represents and why it's important to the story.
Nope.
Not sure at all.
Nope.
Okay.
And before we move on, you talked about the ATL thing. One of the most annoying things, and I think they just patched this, but for whatever reason, I played the game early, and for whatever reason, there was about 6 entries that were locked behind an interaction in New Game Plus only, that you had to talk to Oscar next to Clive's quarters in the hideaway. And
in
you
New Game Plus.
to him in New Game Plus, and you would get the final 6 entries, and they were like massively important.
What? Come on!
I cannot.
So, are any of them about Metia or the moon or?
They were about Ultima. They were about like the world system. I mean, it was a big deal. Like, they were important. And I remember talking to Gerard, the completionist, about this. We were like big mad about that because, like, you get the platinum before you even get those. Like, you just need to get to the final level. But it was like things like Zemeckis and the Children of Zemeckis, like all like the big stuff. And so I don't know. I don't know if they patched that with 1.10. But a lot of people don't have those entries and have the platinum.
Yeah, it was just really strange to me that the game literally starts and almost ends with the image of Metia, and they just literally did nothing with it in the story. And they showed it 100 times throughout the game.
It really felt like DLC bait, and I'm not super into that.
Neither.
Okay, so we don't have to spend much time on that unless you got something, Ryan. Go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I really thought that it would be the home world of Ultima, that you can kind of see in the distance, right? Or lead into that, and it would be connected to Ultima in some way. Right?
And if it were, they could just spend a sentence, and we would be done talking about it.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
Just something like that. Yeah. Would have.
They want people talking and guessing.
Yeah.
What I think.
Yeah. I think you're right, though. That probably will be of all the things that I would imagine a DLC would cover. I mean, that's like prime. That's got to be it. Like, you can't feature that image as many times as you did and not be completely cognizant of, I am establishing a very strong setup right now. This has to be paid off at some point. I have to explain what this thing is and its relevance.
Final Fantasy XVI 2 is going to be a whole thing. So
it was it was literally a red herring. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Literally.
So
it could literally be a red herring flying up along with the pattern of the moon.
One more thing, and then I want to move into just some developer quotes and some dev history stuff. The other thing, oh shoot, I just lost it. We got talking about Metia and I just lost it. There was another thing that they set up.
The girl, the medicine girl.
Okay, there's that, but that wasn't what I was thinking of. What did everyone feel about that? Like, was that similar feeling? Like, did everyone feel like she's going to be important here at some point? They keep showing this girl.
I was like, oh, when the Leviathan DLC drops, we found the dominant.
That's what people are saying.
Yep.
Yeah. She isn't not important. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're going somewhere with her in the DLC for sure.
Which
No.
look,
but isn't that weird? I don't know. I don't.
So
this is why Mike and I want to only analyze games after this whole cycle has run through of the DLC and sequels and everything.
I mean, and there are things that you can set up for DLC that don't. But it's just that there's a couple. Those two in particular, for me, felt like they really were necessary for how the story was going to conclude. Like, the story almost doesn't stand on its own without them. That's the level of setup they had.
Yes.
To have, like, there's a few weird, like, there's this weird character that, the character that takes Gav's eye. Like, you see him lurking about the hideaway later. Like, when the hideaway moves, that dude's still around. It's probably him. You're like, oh, that's a cool little Easter egg you could make DLC out of. I'd be okay with that because it is massively inconsequential. The moon, that is way different. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's suffice to say for now that the game has several instances or examples of this kind of setup where it doesn't necessarily do much to pay it off. It feels like it kind of goes nowhere. So we'll just say, is it fair to say, based on what we've said so far, that for some of us, thematically, the game was rich. It had something there to really dig your teeth into, but that the execution didn't necessarily serve that thematic core as well as it could have?
Yeah, 100%.
Wade, I feel like you might feel differently, so I want to hear that.
I love the ambiguity, to be perfectly honest. So, and I'm okay with that. To me, there were not gaping plot holes in this to me that would utterly unfound and contradict other parts of the game. Now, there are some things that aren't explained, but to me, it's cohesive. In a way.
I just want to clarify. I don't necessarily mean the ambiguity or that like things weren't explained, but like in terms of technical storytelling, they showed us this. They didn't do anything with it later, or instead of doing that, why don't they set up a little bit more? Because, for instance, one thing you said, Wade, that I actually really liked was the idea of Mythos going and collecting all the incomplete or all of the sort of corrupted, maybe, icons, images of what the divine means, collecting all the mythos, all the stories into one, right? There's probably a way, from a more technical storytelling standpoint, is what I mean, that they could have established this concept and sort of like made it have a little more of like a literal analog in the story, in the world of the story, right? I don't know if I'm explaining myself super well, but what I'm getting at is that the game from the beginning sets up what you're talking about as being what this game's about, right? It's saying from right here, from when the game starts, okay, we're going to have a story and this is what it is. It's about this idea about mythos and logos. Instead of the establishing shot of the whole game being Metia, which they do nothing with.
Right.
So my
it's
question
something that is not presented as ambiguous, becoming ambiguous.
Right.
Okay. So I mean, going to Media, the way that I interpreted that is this is the Jill is consistently saying prayers to Media,
right.
And then in the end, once this idea of logos or the person's humanity's personal will is established, to me, the dimming of that red star was this idea that we don't just wish upon a star. We don't pray anymore. This is like we do this now. Like our future is in our hands. And so to me, that was just like a nice symbol. I wasn't thinking in terms of, I see a lot of talk about the FF14 stuff with the red star and planet.
Well, down the mood, right?
A lot of people, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
I don't think there's anything with that. Yeah.
So I just want to cut in real quick. I don't remember if I said this in our last episode, or if I said this in the episode that we recorded and then scrapped in order to do this. So I'm not sure if I said this or not.
I can't remember either.
But I remember saying something along the lines of, I would have been completely fine with Metia being relegated to something like that, like just a symbol of hope for Jill, right? And because you have her praying to the star at the beginning of the game, where she and Clive are kind of standing there looking at it, right? And then you have, again, a really strong tie between the star and Jill and Clive when they go to Murdoch's wife's house, and they like stay in the barn and they're looking up at it, right? There's those two scenes in particular, too, that really tie it to her. If they had only showed Metia those 2 times in the game, I think it would have been perfect as a setup for exactly what you're saying it is. Right. This is a setup for a representation of Jill's hope, and that hope changes from the symbol of the star, which was the mythos, the old world, whatever, into the dawn, the sun rising, which was part of that quest with Clive at the end of the thing. That kind of became their symbol of hope together at the end. She's letting go of the old, accepting the new. That could have all tied in really well had Metia only been highlighted, featured the way that it was in those 2 scenes. But it was the first thing we see in the game. And it seemed like almost in every scene, they would pan up to it. They would spend time framing that up as if it was something beyond that. And naming it even Metia, which is so clearly close to Meteor, I think was... that could have been a great way to set something up. But then, of course, betray that expectation, do something different with it. But I was at least expecting it to have some relevance to the plot rather than just being a symbol to Jill. And I think it's fine being a symbol to Jill without let me throw a more realistic number out there, 25 times that they framed it up throughout the course of the game. You know what I mean? But again, this is something else I want to touch on too, is that I think everybody, it's obvious, everybody goes into something, they have something they value, something that works or doesn't work for them in a game is going to change depending on who you are. From somebody looking at the game from some of that sort of mythical, theological standpoint, I think, especially someone who studied it and really understands it, this is very similar to my experience with Xenogears. First time playing it, what the hell is this even about? I have no idea. Then you go read Freud and you go and read Jung, and it's like, oh wow, this is actually really cool. Yeah. So for somebody who has some background with terms like mythos and logos and these theological concepts, I feel like you're able to sort of draw on those conclusions. For other people who are just looking for technical tightness in the story, I feel like a lot of times that's me. I really focus more on okay, why are we making this choice to put the camera here? Why do we do a dolly in instead of a dolly out? Or why is it a tight shot instead of a wide shot? What are they showing me? What is in this frame that they want me to look at, and why? And what is that? What impact is that going to have later? That's kind of more the way I go about analyzing stuff. And for somebody like that, it felt like there were so many miscues, or like we're saying, red herrings. Right. That it made you think, okay, the story's trying to tell me this now. But it's like, nope, that actually doesn't have any importance. It's actually about this. And what I'm saying is, if it's about the mythos and logos that you're talking about, an idea that I thought was really cool, why don't we start our first shot with something a symbol that represents that? Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. It makes a lot of sense to me in particular. I'm probably the least, I don't want to say least educated, but in terms of knowledge on philosophy and religion and these sorts of aspects, out of the 5 of us, I would definitely be the least qualified to talk on the subject.
Come
for
on,
sure. No. I mean, I don't necessarily, say that to, berate myself or anything like that, but I'm just saying that, I would probably represent maybe a gamer who
you're not
isn't as who isn't going to be as well versed on those things. And so to have a lot of the concepts that this game lays out, I think the thing that kind of drives people's interest into those things about learning about the mythology and the philosophy behind the things that inspired the story is the story, first of all, being a tightly written story, right?
Right.
And then you wanting to know more about the things that inspired the story, and seeing how those things were put together. I find that's how, a lot of modern people consuming these stories are kind of let down that rabbit hole first. And I feel like there are aspects of this story that can be, quite inaccessible, really, if you don't have like a base level of knowledge on those sorts of things. And so, for Wade or for Clark, they're going to be able to dive into these things a lot more immediate, right?
Right.
Than a lot of us are. And I think you could just let's arbitrarily take like Final Fantasy VII. I feel like a lot of people could not know about any of the philosophical or mythological inspirations behind FF7, but they'll play it and they can know what the story is about and a lot of the themes behind it, and they can really wrap their head around it. And I think it just insanely deepens their appreciation whenever they do find out about those things. Whereas I feel like a lot of the times in Final Fantasy XVI, it was just like, if you don't know about those things, then you can't access the story.
Right. And I agree. I think that whenever you have something that's really reliant on outsourced symbolism, like Xenogears or Final Fantasy 16 or Final Fantasy 7 or Nier. Nier's a really good example.
Nier's a lot too. Yeah.
There's something inherently about the way that it's presented that lets you know, hey, there's a depth to this that is drawing on something outsourced, and there's something that can naturally draw you to learning about that thing. There's something about the presentation of Nier in particular that says, hey, there's mysteries here. Let's go explore. Let me learn what this meant.
Yeah.
16, although it relies heavily, very, very heavily on said outsourced symbolism, it packs so much like internal lore and building within the system of the active time lore that you don't necessarily think the answers are coming from outside. And so it's not presented as the same kind of, mystery box thing. Like, I happen to be lucky enough to have the knowledge, as does Wade. Whereas, I wasn't particularly versed in Jungian psychology or, even Gestalt when I first played Nier. And I played that and I immediately knew I need to learn about those things. I don't know if you'd have that experience with Final Fantasy 16. I don't think.
And what do you think the difference is? Why do you think that is? What is I know this is kind of a spotlight question. You might not have an answer for it, but is there an example of, like, in this game, this happened and that's why I knew I got to go find out what that means, and what element of that is missing here?
Well, part of it is I recognize the names of people. I was like, this is a name of a person that doesn't fit this world system. I'm going to go look up Gildenkratz and Rose, or Guildenstern, or I'm going to go look up, this name. Everything, the way that Final Fantasy 16 is presented is, hey, you need to learn something, press and hold the center button. It's not presented as something that is going to teach you about Gnosticism. It's not presented that way. It's presented as if it's this thing that has a complete lore set that is entirely available to you. It's this weird thing where, and I'm not saying that I think people would be really lost without the active time lore. Don't get me wrong. Like, they'd be way gone without the active time lore. But the active time lore did eliminate a lot of the curiosity, and instead a lot of people, I think, were just looking at this going, well, I've read all the active time lore and I don't know what this meant.
Okay.
The problem is we are fighting for the Logos when they've just given us the Mythos.
Yes,
that's actually a really good way to leave off on that point. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to move into some dev quotes because there's a couple things in particular, not only related just to this game, but to the series at large, I'd love to talk to you guys about. So regarding the theme, kind of the core message of the game, I have this quote from Yoshida where he says, one of the main themes explored in Final Fantasy XVI's narrative deals with the inevitable clash of values and ideals when you get multiple different people with different ideals in the same room. What is truly right and what is truly wrong. Again, because we focus so much on their dominance and they have such a large part in the story, you're going to see how they think the world should be and what they think is right for the world. You're going to focus on those motivations and their struggles, and then you're going to delve even deeper and get into darker themes when it comes to how people should live. Should people live the life that was chosen for them, or fight and break free from that kind of destiny? So there's a few things to break down in there, but as an overall quote from the horse's mouth, so to speak, about what this game is about, how well do you think they accomplished I guess, delivering that message?
I think he accurately described Final Fantasy XIV's.
Nice.
Right. Like, I think that FF14 definitely achieves that. And they definitely, wanted to do that here again, especially with Heavensward's Rider. And I feel like Heavensward's Rider, Heavensward is kind of where that theme really comes in quite well, when you have the war between man and dragon. And it's been going on for, I can't even remember how long. It's been going on for like thousands of years. And the dragons have a completely different perception of time because they live for like, tens of thousands of years, if I'm not mistaken. And so to them, what was just yesterday, to human beings, it was so long ago. And you have this conflict that, kind of spirals out of control. And then you have the church sort of manipulating things in the background. And that's a really well done story that kind of, has the different characters like Azael and Estinian that are all having different philosophies and coming from different viewpoints, and then kind of, coming together in the healing that happens after that war. And that story portrays all that really well, in my opinion, for what it's worth. However, for Final Fantasy XVI, to just be blunt, and this could be a failing of me and not necessarily the game, but it really does become hard to remember even what a lot of people's philosophies necessarily were, because I guess it just didn't stand out to me enough to be like, wow, it's really something I'm going to carry with me in this story. I mean, aside from Barnabas, who was basically screaming what his ideals were, and then some aspects of Benedicta, which, I feel like her character had so much potential, and they really cut her short, unfortunately. Cid's ideals would probably be the one that stand out by far the most, and that's kind of the foundation of the game. But
Cid's ideals become Clive's ideals, basically.
Right. Clive inherits Cid's ideals. So but I can't really say that was kind of the standout thing for me necessarily. Again, that could also be a failing of me. So, but that's how I would recall it.
Anybody else want to step up?
I think that you're onto a lot there, Ryan. When I think about the game, I think about the motivations and the perspectives that we get from the Empire. This idea of justice, especially with Dion. We get some ideas of certainly piety and righteousness, and this pursuit of these very holy practices with Waloed. The Iron Kingdom faltered for me. I'm not really sure what ideals they stood for. Maybe you can help me out there a little bit. But it does seem like each of these different groups is focused on survival, their way of life, and what works for them. And that does come into conflict. But the interesting thing here that I think does set it apart in some ways from 14 is that we get Clive, who, again, like I said earlier, he is going to embody the good parts of all of these. There is something to those perspectives, but they are in conflict. So how do you bring an alleviation to that tension of coexistence?
How about you, Clark?
I think Sid's mission, was the only purely effectively conveyed reflection of that developer statement. I mean, the developer statement sounded very developer statement-y to me, which has
Sound like PR speak.
True.
And there was a little bit of PR.
Some legalese.
David Mencken actually had a conversation with me. He's the voice actor for Barnabas. He said that all of the characters were inspired by an absolute belief that what they were doing would serve those and their loved ones. He said that applied to every character, and I think it definitely applied to Barnabas based on his active Time Lore entries and the weird interactions that we see. But the only character that really, I know what this character is fully about because he's speaking it clearly is Sid. And I think they nailed Sid. And I think that Sid, having a mantle through Clive, worked to kind of drive that home thematically, But other than that, I do feel like I don't know what the Iron Kingdom was about. It was just a opportunity for us to spend a criminally short amount of time with one of the female characters in the game.
Right.
You brought up something I meant to bring up earlier. Was how did you guys feel about Jill not going with
At the end?
Dion and Joshua and Clive? Like, why stay behind?
I go.
That was really rough for me, and that really goes back to this idea, with her and Joshua kind of explicitly saying, like, you can't do this alone, and then for her to not go, it just didn't sit right with me. I feel like it just would have been so much more effective to have had her there. And not only just to have had her there, but also to have her play a major role. And I think that it just would have been awesome to just have the four of them, fighting Ultima together. Like those last four dominants coming together. Yeah, you would. Someone in chat said it would have been 4 Warriors of Light. Wouldn't that have been so cool?
It would have been a party-based game, sort of.
Yeah. All right. And it would have been so thematically appropriate too, because it's kind of like they're right. Because Final Fantasy and their connections over
the friendship and
killing God. That's what it's all about. It would have really worked quite well for me. And I also think too that, kind of going back on that scene, not to go too far off topic too, I kind of hate that Clive just takes Joshua's power, instead of, in the end, at the very least, you could have had Joshua and Clive fusing together to at least bring together that moment of, our bonds can overcome any adversity.
But why didn't they do that then, you think?
I'm still struggling to figure that out, honestly,
like
because there's
up to that.
Right. It just almost feels like they needed Joshua to die for some reason or another, and so they couldn't have that moment, and so they had to have a thing where he takes the Phoenix power from Joshua, but then he had already got the blessing of the Phoenix. I think Mike touched on this in the podcast too. So, there's some type of distinguishment here between him like getting the Phoenix, but then how is he still able to transform into Ifrit Risen by himself? But then right. Because he can't transform into the other dominants, right? So I feel like it should have been a requirement that Joshua is there. And honestly, too, what I actually think that the logo for Final Fantasy XVI is like one of the coolest Final Fantasy logos, because it's not just Ifrit and Phoenix fighting; it's also them fusing.
Yeah, it's them
together.
Yeah, and so and so I think that's like an awesome logo, because it has like that really sick double meaning behind it, and where you start the game, you think it means one thing, you finish the game, and it recontextualizes, right? And really powerful in that sense. So yeah, I wasn't a very big fan at all of just Clive being alone in those final moments, because I think
I'd like to call something out real quick, and this is to a person in the comments named Rafael Toledo. This is a sentiment that I struggle to understand. It was shared a little bit even last week, where people were upset that we were bashing the game for an hour and a half or something like that. And I saw you say something a little earlier about, facepalm, like they explained what the Iron Kingdom was all about. So obviously you're a big fan of the game. That's why we're doing this. We don't usually do these live publicly like this. Yeah. The reason we're doing that is because we want you guys to join the conversation. So instead of facepalming, please feel free to give your 2 cents on that, and I'll read it. Because if it's going to clarify something, we want to know that. We're not here to bash the game. Criticism, you guys need to understand. I think this is especially something the Final Fantasy community as a whole really needs to grapple with badly. Criticism is not negative. It's not bashing. It can be. If somebody's going to step into Sarah and be like, "Oh, this game's piece of shit, sucks ass," blah blah, like obviously that's not constructive. That's not going to help anybody, particularly the developers. With we're going to take that feedback into consideration and let's try to do something next time. Yeah. Can you copy and paste it then? Because I didn't see it, so just copy and paste it real quick. But my point is, you don't have to get upset. We're not doing this because we're mad the game wasn't what we wanted it to be. We're doing this because we love Final Fantasy. Yeah. And we want to give our 2 cents, and if any of that can be useful to developers, because according to them, they watch conversations like this. Right. They go on YouTube and they seek it out. So they invite it. Yeah. So let's give them the most clear, concise, and constructive feedback that we can. And if something we've said is not doesn't make sense, we want to be corrected on that too. So 100%. Please post your feelings on it. Don't just get angry and feel like we're here to hate on something, because nobody here went into this game with any intention other than to love it. And obviously,
especially after that demo.
Right? A great demo. Yeah,
it was fire. I gotta give it to him. The first couple hours of the game are quite intriguing.
Okay, so while I wait for him to come back with that real quick, go ahead, Clark.
I still think this is a good game. I think that there are games that have less flaws that I enjoyed less than this. I think a good example is that I think there's I think Ghost of Tsushima is one of the most flawless games ever made.
I love that game.
My gross enjoyment of this game was higher than that game. Not because I agree. I just think that there's this, there's this way that we sort of grade games where we're like, it starts at 100%. It has an A as it's spoken into the world, and then each negative deducts points until it's down to a C or a D or an F. That is not the way that I experience art. I really enjoyed my experiences with Final Fantasy XVI, and I think even voicing my criticisms of them, seeing where things failed, seeing where things could be better, those are all ways that I'm actually still enjoying this intellectual property. I'm still enjoying this piece of art, because my gross enjoyment, like I said, of the experience was better than a game that had less flaws. Because it's not a paper, it's art. As far as the Iron Kingdom goes, I know there's a purpose for it. I think Wade's point on the Iron Kingdom, and I kind of agree, is that it certainly doesn't really fit the developer quotes kind of core sentiment. It's this kind of aberrant, underdeveloped area that had potential to be this big thing that kind of wasn't. It's visually really impressive, and again, it just kind of brings us to Jill, and To answer your question about Jill, for me personally,
yes,
I would have liked to see Jill have a expanded role. I don't necessarily know if that needed to have her go to Origin. I was okay with her, like, from a structural story standpoint, staying behind to defend the hideaway and everything that Clive built with Torgal and Gav and Mid and everybody. I was okay with that from a thematic point of view. I do think that she had a bunch of other missed opportunities to develop and be part of, and you know, wouldn't be horrible if she was playable in the DLC. You know, personally, what do you think, Wade,
Playable
about the
though,
Jill thing?
this game.
Okay, can I cut in real quick?
Yeah.
I'm going to cut in real quick just to get back to Raphael because I said I would. So I think this is mostly just a misunderstanding of the context of the conversation. So he says, Iron Kingdom was extreme piety, rejection of bearers, use of magic at all costs due to the crystals being manifestations of the gods and not being used. That was my original post.
So the good aspect of that Clive then takes is the not using magic or wanting to stop using magic.
Well,
right?
well, maybe, but let me get through the rest of this here. That was my original post when everyone was saying they didn't understand the Iron Kingdom's philosophy. I don't think anyone's saying we don't understand the Iron Kingdom's philosophy.
I understood that one.
What we were saying was in context of the developer quote that I read, where they said the core theme of the game is about a bunch of different perspectives from all these different places and what's really right and what's really wrong. That there aren't many examples that we can find in the game that fulfill that particular vision of the theme. The things that Wade talked about with Mythos and Logos, the things that Clark talked about in the beginning, those things, the theological, more some of the abstract concepts, right, kind of are what end up being what the game focuses on by the end. And so this is what we're talking about, and specifically what I'm talking about in terms of technical storytelling. Technical storytelling is all about where do we put the audience, the reader, the gamer, the viewer, their focus in this moment to moment, in this paragraph, in this sentence, what am I saying to them and why? In this shot, what am I showing them and why? Those who are masters of their craft don't waste a second, a sentence, a word, right? All of those things are pointing at what is this work trying to say? According to the developer quote, it's trying to say something very different from what these guys talked about at the beginning of this podcast. So I hear what they say and I go, oh, that's a really cool idea. Why did we start the game with our camera focused on Metia? Why are we using this time to establish this thing here when in the end we're really going to turn our focus away from these kingdoms and their perspectives and what's right and wrong and bearers, even, freeing bearers, and it's more this you're even saying internal struggle between you had two terms for it, I'm forgetting them now, the narcissist and is it the nemesis?
Nemesis and narcissist,
yeah, right.
That's the myth.
This is a symbol of the introspective process of that. Okay, so where was that set up? In the opening act of the game.
It was.
Let's hear it. I want to hear that.
It wasn't.
Oh, it was not, is what you're saying. Okay.
Oh,
so this is what I'm saying, is that when I come to my conclusion on the game, as somebody who values very much technical storytelling finesse, this game I found to be very lacking. But if like Wade was saying, you're going into this with a theological lens, you're going into this looking at themes and concepts and symbols, you're going to talk about Grieger in your stream after this today. Is that what you're going over?
Not today, but
not today. Eventually you will. Yeah. If you're looking at those things, Kaysen does a lot of that in our podcast, right?
The most fascinating part of the game was Grieger, and also a little disappointing in the way that Grieger ended up not being very relevant, I'd say, I guess.
What we're coming around to is that none of this is hating, right? And we are enjoying ourselves in having a conversation like this. That's what I'm talking about when I say criticism is not like by default or inherently a negative thing. This is a way for all of us to reflect on our experience, to share, and to grow from that dialogue between each other, to change opinions, to solidify them, whatever it might be. But that's what art inspires. And so it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, that was the 10 out of 10 greatest thing of all time. As Clark alluded to, sometimes the games that have more failings than perfect finesse are more interesting to talk about. So there's no need to get angry in these conversations and to have all the infighting in the community of Final Fantasy. I have very different conclusions about my thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Remake, for instance, than Clark does. I think most people who know the two of us would know that we couldn't be more opposite as far as our conclusions on that. But we're good friends.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to affect anything because we can have conversations like this and they can be very productive.
Right.
Okay.
And also me and Clark. But Clark will also tell you though that there's nothing I hate more than when people try to make bad arguments about Final Fantasy VII Remake story, because it irritates me to no end. Yeah. Like, I have criticisms of it, but I think that there's people who just make really baseless criticism. I don't even like when people do it about Final Fantasy XIII, and a lot of people know how I feel about that game, because a lot of people will just slap that game with, it's too linear. Yeah. And that drives me insane, because I'm like, linearity is like, that's such like a bad criticism of that game. So I think everyone here, you know, not only does criticism come from a place of wanting to see things do better, wanting to see the people do better. You guys know I'm a huge Yoshi P fan, and I would love to see him work on another mainline title, and I definitely want him to do better. And I think that he's already done a great job. He made my favorite Final Fantasy story of all time. Final Fantasy XIV.
I think a lot of people who are not necessarily super high on my opinions of the series, and I want to get into the series at large here now, move in that direction a little bit, would try to characterize me as some kind of Sakaguchi stan or something like that. Like, if it's not Sakaguchi, then it's not Final Fantasy. And I can tell you very much, there's several projects that Sakaguchi has led that I've not been a super huge fan of. I did not like Fantasian. I did not like Blue Dragon. Even like some of the earlier Final Fantasy games, there's plenty there that I would criticize. So that's not the point of criticism. It's not about taking sides. And we got our 7R tribe versus our CBU3 tribe here, right? That shouldn't be the point, fellas.
Yeah. So really bizarre factionalization.
I would like to read something really quick from Dream Poem in chat.
Is he here in the chat?
He's here in the chat. Nice. He says that Media representing star-crossed lovers. Astrologically, a star represents fate over people. It dims because the fate is broken, even if it ends in tragedy. And I mean, my response to that would be that, like, I think that's actually a very cool way of looking at it. I guess that only, like, my problem would be is that, like, that, I guess, to be frank, from a normie perspective, going into this, and with the game so heavily leaning on something like Game of Thrones and trying to be a title with kind of like the widespread appeal, is a mainstream audience that wouldn't be as well versed on this going to even be able to pick up on the surface level meaning as well as someone who is, right? And so that's kind of the challenge, I think, in writing like these very big budget stories, is that yes, you do want that philosophical depth to be there, but then you also want the story to be told in such a solid way that your average person will, at least on the surface level, be able to be really gripped by it. And I think that I wouldn't have personally picked up on that. That would have went way over my head. Now that you've given me that, I can certainly see some appreciation for it.
Well, I actually think that's pretty similar to what Wade was saying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think that was the bare minimum interpretation. It honestly felt like It should have been more. And again, I think this is what we're talking about with, this outsourced symbolism construct. Like you talked about at the end, the main themes, the things that really resonated with Wade and I. What in the first act lets us know that that's what the game is about. Well, ultimately, I do think there is a little bit. I do think that the answer that they give to how do you break the oppression that we see displayed as a background problem to the world system is answered through the final act. But there is still this disconnect between the way that, say, and I hate to bring up Nier or even the Xeno games again, but those give you these really clear signals. Hey, we are using symbolism that comes from outside of the game's internal lore. And I don't think that storytelling should pander. I don't think that it should treat its audience as not intelligent, but there is at least a bare minimum expectation to give us a symbol within the game to let us know to look outside if that's where we need to look.
Yeah.
And I think other games have done that a little better. But I do think that once like if you happen to be in the specific position that Wade and I are in, this is a really great ending.
Wade, I think you've had something you've wanted to say there. I've seen you itching.
One of the things that I keep coming back to is there seems to have been a shift in Square Enix's philosophy over the last few iterations of Final Fantasy. 16, 15 to a degree, certainly 13, and I would argue 12 as well, began to take on these elements of ambiguity for the purpose. And I think you guys mentioned this on your last episode. They wanted to create fodder for discussion. And so they're not giving all of the answers, the specifics. Some things are happening off screen or inferred, or what do you think really happened there? When I'm approaching this game and a lot of new Square Enix games, I tend not to think that any of them are incomplete, but instead they're intentional. Right now, sometimes maybe they've dropped things on the editing floor. I think that Final Fantasy XV, particularly the beginning, turning out to be a movie at Kingsglaive, that was certainly an editing choice or whatever. But when it comes to these pieces of art, why did they do the things they did? Now, my criticisms can be, man, I wish there was fishing in this game. There's beautiful water in the desert, right? Like, we could have really done some stuff. Why did they put in chocobo drift mechanics if you're not going to do anything with chocobos, right? That's one of
not getting racing or anything.
Yeah. That is mind-blowing. But the game that they gave us was intentional. So does it work? A, and B, why did they do that? Why narratively? And so it's the difference between criticizing a game because it's not my expectation of what it is and criticizing it based on what it tried to be, I guess. And so that kind of going back a few conversations to the basis of where I'm going to critique. From a fundamental level in this game, I feel like almost everything in it works. And you get a cohesive story beginning to end, like we've said, but some of the things are peculiar. They do seem to set up some things like party basis and dynamics. When Dion and it's in the just before they go to the final Mother Crystal, when Dion and Jill and others come in and rush and save the day, it's like we're finally going to get a party and let's all like fight together. Why didn't they do that? Well, kind of the answer would, I would be interested in what the developers were really going for there, because like my expectation was finally Final Fantasy, Warriors of Light, let's go. But because they subvert that expectation, like, what is the payoff there? And
I mean, I think part of the answer is because you're at hour 70 in the game.
You're right.
It doesn't mean it'll take longer, though, just to have more people be there at the end.
Here's another question, similar to the Chocobo Drift. Why do you play as Joshua in the prologue? And no other time are you playing as in anybody else. Like
some of the icons for like a good 1 solid minute apiece. Yeah. You even get to control You even get to press a button for Bahamut twice.
Yeah.
Great.
And I actually think too that playing as young Joshua and then having that contrast of playing as the older version of him would have been really fascinating, right?
Yeah.
To see how his character has grown and strengthened his mastering his abilities too, right? Because you remember he can cast some really powerful spells like Faraga and Kiraga, but then as soon as he does, he's like, he's completely tired, right? Yeah. And so it's just hard because there is multiple times in this game where a lot of the story beats are pretty good, but then it would have just been enhanced so much more by being able to play as that character and have that moment from their perspective. Yeah. Like someone says
particularly if the idea here is to jump between all these different points of view and have like a real struggle between like, okay, what's right? I mean, was there any point where we thought, oh, wait a minute, is Benedicta right and Clive wrong? Like, did anyone actually ask themselves
or Barnabas or Ultima? No,
yeah.
Never.
Now, would you have, had you been able to, like you're saying, actually jump into their perspective, like be that character from this point in time? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that being said, there was a point where I thought Clive was wrong.
That's true.
And the whole Klein Rand moment. I do want to know what everybody here thought of that, by the way, by Clive's hard stance on a super radical individualism, like objectivism.
Anybody want to weigh in that? Hold on, before we go there, Ryan, you were going to say something about a comment, weren't you?
Oh, someone had mentioned to my point that controlling Jill in the Iron Kingdom would have been a great. Really, a really great moment 100%. To have really seen things in her perspective. And I thought that was a pretty decent moment for her character, but it would have elevated it quite a lot if you were really seeing that from her perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Now on to the Klein Rand. Anybody who watched our podcast,
you can disagree with me. I'm just saying this is one of those moments where their themes didn't line up.
It was such a weird, bizarre, meta commentary when Joshua almost takes on the mantle of the player and punches Clive. You're like, okay, so there's some self-awareness here, and it's interesting. Right. And I do think that there's a chance, and that's, and I've thought about that a lot and still don't know if maybe I'm missing something. I still do think there's a chance that there was an intent behind that I didn't connect with, and I always do like to try and meet the artists where they're at and try and figure out what their intent was. That's smart, and before I really gauge whether something worked or not. I can criticize them for not conveying that well enough that I understood it. But I also don't like when stories do that. I don't like stories that pander to me. So I'll probably read the Ultimania before I
which comes out tomorrow, right?
Which comes out.
Oh, really? Oh, shoot! We're ending our podcast one day before
all the answers.
Right? Great timing.
Yeah. Okay. Before we find out that Media was just 50,000 layers of deep. That we were just too dumb. Yeah.
It's subtext. You guys all missed it when right over as far as Klein Rand goes, that's just to me a way that the themes of the game start to conflict, and there may have not been some perfect cohesion in terms of the thematic material, where it's I don't know if they thought it through necessarily, especially in those moments.
I think if you wrote the story in a novel, it would.
You mentioned that at the beginning, and I think you're probably right. I've been thinking about that.
Yeah.
For the past 2 hours now, and I'm thinking I think there's something to that. That if this were a novel, you wouldn't have the whole it should have been a party dynamic, right? If it were a novel, it would have read similarly to if you turned in FF6 into a novel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there's two things I want to do before we close out, since we're already to 7:42 now.
Do you want to ask Wade why his parents didn't name him Wedge?
Should have been Wedge.
And here's the other one.
Wedge. Should have been Wedge.
Listen,
Have you ever told your mom that?
I did after this game came out. I was like, did you ever consider naming me Wedge?
You're probably the only person who was happy that his name was Wade.
I was so happy. Like I screamed. I was like, ah, it's me.
Okay, Mike, continue.
So the two things I want to do. First of all, I want to go around real quick and just have everyone talk about what their favorite thing about the game was. To sort of just like balance out this sort of a lull we've been in. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to move into one final thing kind of unrelated to FF16 and more to the series as a whole. So who wants to start?
I think I can start.
Okay.
I love that this game was M-rated, and I love that it did not put them in a position where they had to cut or modify certain things in order to meet, let's be honest, Zero, the Japanese rating board, in order to meet their very strict rating system, which is a big part of why the blood trail in Final Fantasy VII Remake had to be altered, because they wanted that teen rating. And you cannot have pools of blood. Now, some people will point to things like intermission, where Yuffie has blood on her. You can have like little splotches of blood, but you can't have pools of blood. The reason you can't have pools of blood is because pools of blood is thought of as gore. And so when you do that, it instantly becomes a mature rated game there. And so this even affects Resident Evil. I don't know if you guys know this, but there is Resident Evil is actually censored in Japan if you buy the retail version. You actually have to go online and buy the Z version. That's like the Zero rating. The Z version, that's uncensored. You can only buy it online because they can't sell it in stores, because it's basically like the ESRB equivalent of the adults only rating, right? But we just get the completely uncensored version here in the US. So Zero is really strict. I think going for the M rating was really good. I also think that this game probably handles nudity and sexuality in the most mature way that I've seen any JRPG handle those things. And I think it was a huge step forward. I think that there wasn't any there's like a lot of tropes about the protagonist being like, oh my god, I'm seeing the girl like doing it.
Oops, I slipped on top of you. Oh no, it's so embarrassing.
The blush those types of tropes. I mean, I don't know how many people I speak for, but it's so unfortunate, to see those tropes being used so many times, because I personally don't care for them much. In this game, I feel like it was handled mature, and it was handled like it was written by an adult for adults. And I really want to see more of that. I think that was something that I want more from the franchise, is just handling things in that M rating with that maturity, not having to shy away from things. And I think the delivery of it was quite good in this game, and it actually used that M rating pretty effectively.
Nice. I agree with basically everything you just said. That's great.
Yeah.
How about you, Clark?
I think if we're to pick one thing, I'm just gonna say Dion in general.
Dion is the best answer there is.
Yes.
Deion Sanders, new head coach of the CU Buffaloes. Making waves.
It's yeah. I thought the representation was really good. It was important. It was really avoided a lot of annoying tropes, and I even think that people were upset that he died at the end, or he sacrificed himself. But to me, that was really that was important. That kind of self-sacrifice is an honor generally, particularly in Japanese culture, reserved for straight cishet men. And so I thought that it was a unique honor, and then just the just complex, like his scene with Harpocrates.
That's great.
It was so tastefully written. I think some of the best writing of like a single small, scenario, like side quest chain, comes there. And then all the little details that got called up, like during the Bahamut fight, like the stage, expanding into that flower was really dramatic. And then also, there is just this little kid in me that remembers Final Fantasy and wanting to fight dragons and kaiju fights, and go into space to fight Bahamut as Ifrit ascended was just great for me. I just loved the spectacle. I thought the whole thing was good. And then I know you only gave me one, but number 2 is the voice performances absolutely carried a lot of the characterizations and probably
For sure.
did a lot of the writers' works for them. So
For sure.
Not fair, you got 2.
Got both of them. All right, Wade. What was your favorite?
What's left? They took it. No, the more that I've thought about this game, the more I realize, for me at least, it is the realization of all of the things that I loved about Final Fantasy up to this point. And so I actually made a post on Twitter a couple of days ago that was like completely ratioed, but it was the idea that 16 gives us what Square Enix and the developers always wanted us to have, like Cecil's moment of facing the shadow self. Clive gets that, and it's like, what if that was fully acted, and what if it was cinematic and this moment of redemption? It gives us these amazing morphs, like Terra in Final Fantasy VI into an Esper. It gives us a love story that's fully acted, and not only that, but like it's a grown-up love story. I was describing with somebody, Squall and Renoa have a puppy love, teenage love story, but Clive and Jill have a 30-something love story, and like when you're older, it's like, gosh, this is real and grounded, and it was deeply, deeply powerful to me. The music, the immersion, all of it came together, and by the end, I was like, this was an iteration of Final Fantasy that usurped, it kind of countered expectations in a lot of ways, and yet it fulfilled them in what a Final Fantasy truly is. So for me, that was it. It felt Final Fantasy through and through, and it was more than just crystals and chocobos.
How about you, Kason? What was your favorite part of the game?
King Kupka and Bahamut. Those icon fights were an absolute blast. They were very fun. That's probably what made the game enjoyable for me.
You didn't think it was over the top, the fist punching as fast as possible?
I did think it was over the top. I loved
in a good way, though.
Yeah, I didn't mind that at all. I didn't mind it at all.
Okay, let's see. Clark basically took the one I was going to do, but if I'm going to pick another instead, the one thing I liked as a sort of subversion from sort of the typical Final Fantasy sort of setup for crystals, right? The fact that the crystals needed to be destroyed, the crystals were the source of the blight and magic, and the fact that the crystals, I guess that was hinted right from the very beginning, the crystals, the legacy of the crystals, right? What was the exact wording on that? Has governed us from far too long, or something like that. Has ran
legacy of the crystals has
something our fate for far too long. Anyway, governed our fate, something like that, right? Since the very beginning, the crystals in the series have always sort of represented like, oh, they're dying, we have to restore them, and this was literally a total table flip on that concept. And I thought that was a really cool way to integrate them as a common sort of like tying it to the legacy of the series, but doing it in a way that was shaped our history. Thank you, Doom Guy. kind of doing a different turn on the crystals are evil this time, right? So I kind of liked that as like a little bit of a twist on the common Final Fantasy story that features crystals, which are, oh no, they've shattered, oh no, they've been corrupted, the wind is stopped, the world balance is thrown out, we need to go restore the light of the crystals. This was the reverse of that. I kind of liked that aspect. Okay. Last thing. Oh, Sid is a great answer from Prem. Sid's a really good character too. Sid's probably my second favorite character in the game after Dion. He was my favorite, and then like game started focusing on Dion a little more. And I was like, okay, Dion's my favorite character. Last thing that I want to discuss. I feel like we could sit here forever. I really do.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm gonna have to say, trust me, bro, that what I'm about to tell you is not a trust me, bro situation. I have the quotes, but we just don't have the time for me to scan through 17 pages to find them. There are two specific quotes that I found in doing the dev history on this game, researching about it, that stuck out to me as like the thing I could not ignore, like the thing that'll be burned into my brain and I will never forget in terms of all this stuff I read. One, it was, and I just had it here. Who is the director of the game? Not the producer, but the director.
Hiroshi Takai.
Hiroshi Takai. He's a big God of War fan. He does not shy away from this in his interviews. He talks about how basically, like, I can't lie, I was very inspired by God of War when I made this game. He talks about how he imported the game into Japan to get it earlier because he just couldn't wait for God of War back on the PS2, right? So he loves God of War. And he says that God of War's influence was pretty large in terms of the way he approached constructing this game, right? Like the development, the design philosophy behind, particularly like hub area versus like, anyway, I won't get into the whole quote, but that's the main point is there. He really looked to God of War for inspiration on Final Fantasy XVI. Of course, we know they brought in Suzuki, battle designer from Capcom, who had worked on games like Monster Hunter, Dragon's Dogma, and Devil May Cry 5. So you see some of those influences heavily, I think, in the combat system, which was a huge deviation from past iterations of Final Fantasy combat. Lastly, and the one that stuck out to me the most, there's a quote from Yoshida saying that when because this game started development right before Final Fantasy 15 release. So we're talking, 2016, 2015, maybe even something like that, right? A while ago. So this is right in the midst of Game of Thrones being at its height of popularity, probably around season 4 era. And he bought the boxed sets, made everybody sit down in the office and watch that and said, this is the kind of fantasy that people really like right now. We need to write a story like this. So, that hurt me to read. I'm not going to lie. Because it was once true, as I was growing up, that the Final Fantasy series was a trend-setting series. Alongside Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest created this whole subgenre we now call JRPGs. They were the ones that made that what it is, right? And they set the trends. And now we have developers going out of their way to make the series feel more like other popular things, whether it's the storytelling, whether it's the game design philosophy. Now, I watched a video from Wade, I want to say maybe like a month or two ago, where you talked about the discourse surrounding Final Fantasy. What is Final Fantasy, right? I'm sure we've all had this argument for probably over a decade now with people online. And what I came away from after reading that was I'm not even saying this as somebody who is a fan or, I'm upset about the way the series... I'm not speaking from that place. I'm very much detached from that now. I've kind of let that go. I work in marketing, and I've studied a lot about current sort of like philosophy on brand strategy and how to create consistent brands. And my conclusion after watching the last 10 years or so, when did Final Fantasy 13 come out? 2010?
2010 in the US.
Maybe a little longer than that. Probably more like 15, 20 years. I have seen this brand, the Final Fantasy brand, have identity crisis after identity crisis. Nobody agrees on what it should be because everybody is a fan of a different project, and that's the one they like, and that's the one they think it should be. And they're being headed by different teams and different creators with totally different philosophies on how it should be moved forward and how they should solve this problem. There's a quote at the beginning of my notes here that says there's so much pressure with being the lead designer, the creative director of a mainline Final Fantasy project, Yoshida talks about. And I think that pressure is entirely self-made by the corporate decisions of Square Enix and the fact that they have what seems to be zero idea, zero vision. What is Final Fantasy? Ryan made a video saying, I don't care what it is as long as they pick it and they do that next time and iterate on it moving forward. So you've done a video on that kind of already. I kind of got your thoughts on that. But it seems to me that with all the infighting, we're all here have seen this. We were on Twitter or X or whatever the hell it's called now. And we see the people fighting about it. We see the people in our comments section fighting about it. It's in a really, I would be scared if I was a brand manager of Final Fantasy. Like, it's a mess in my opinion. So,
I don't think that job exists, but yeah.
Probably not. Well, I think it's supposed to be Kitase, but anyway.
Oh, okay.
Now he just recently got the job.
Oh, okay.
I see.
So, I guess where I'm going with this is I would like to get everybody's thoughts first on what is it that you value about Final Fantasy? What is it at the core that you look for when you play a Final Fantasy game? What is that to you? I think, Wade, you just touched on some things that you felt existed here in this game that, referential to the series legacy and that sort of thing. Is there an identity in your mind, or maybe not even that? Let's not go there. Let's not try to pronounce what the identity is. Let's just talk about what we value or valued about it the most. Kaysen, you go first. We haven't done you first in this whole time.
Never happens. Yeah, what I value most about Final Fantasy, I mean, it's not the final. I value the fantasy better than the final. Oh, that's about it. I don't know what to say. It's all about turn-based. It's all about the medieval fantasy stuff. I don't mind.
But you love 7, and that wasn't medieval, so maybe that's
not it. I
loved
7 a lot.
Good choice.
I don't know that I'm necessarily prepared
to answer the question.
Answer exactly what it is. But what I love about it is that it tends to be story focused, and that it does tend to have a really interesting blend of the typical medieval fantasy elements, along with maybe more modern type elements. I find that really intriguing. But I don't know that I can necessarily pin it down. So I would not be a good brand manager. Now, I have other ideas about what necessarily the spirit of Final Fantasy is. But yeah, I don't know that I can necessarily pin it down, especially not now after everything that they've done.
Okay. Let's move to Wade.
I don't want to rehash my entire video on this. What I will say is, for the more that I've thought about Final Fantasy, every iteration is a deeply human story of resistance and rebellion against some struggle, or like I said in my video, a cycle that is unending. Now, you could argue all kinds of stories, and JRPGs particularly are about ending some kind of cycle, but the way that Final Fantasy does it is through a commitment to immersion in that story. It's a commitment to some of the properties that it has. These kind of core properties of chocobos or Moogles and their aesthetic. But ultimately, their number one commitment is not to gameplay or any specific mode. It is to that story. So they're looking at the landscape, whether that is Call of Duty or Game of Thrones or whatever. And they're saying, how can we tell the greatest story that speaks to the human spirit, given technology, music, and current trends? To me, that is what differentiates Final Fantasy from every other franchise. Not to say that they aren't good. In fact, with Baldur's Gate 3's popularity, I would imagine that Final Fantasy 18 will probably be that. Not 17, because they probably worked on that 2 years ago.
Already started it.
Yeah. But, I mean, that's it. They're constantly trying to tell really the same story with a whole new veneer, using new characters and technology and all that. To me, it's the heart of it, the story.
Okay. How about you, Clark?
Let Ryan go first on this one.
All right, Ryan, go for it.
So, to some degree, I might actually disagree that Final Fantasy hasn't in some ways trend chased before. I just think that they've always presented it in their own way that was so unique and compelling and had its own style that became the trend. Because if you go back to Final Fantasy I mean, it was heavily influenced by Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, if you can call anything the progenitor RPG, it's Dungeons and Dragons, for sure. And you look at Final Fantasy
Ultima, and those PC RPGs that Sakaguchi played, Wizardry, things like that.
Right. And those were hugely influenced, and those also have their roots in D&D as well. And I mean, even looking at FF1's Bestiary, half of a good chunk of those enemies come straight out of D&D. The Mind Flayer is in Final Fantasy 1, right? And I think if you actually look at what D&D is all about, kind of using your imagination and connections with people to go on this as large as your imagination journey is, I think that is also quintessentially what Final Fantasy is. And Final Fantasy is its own branded interpretation and its own style of approaching what is fundamental to the role-playing game, is going on something, going on that adventure that pushes to the absolute limits. And Sakaguchi recently said, I believe it was in the 35th anniversary kind of discussion video that they did regarding the pixel remasters. And he said one thing that he liked about the name Final Fantasy was that you could also read it like Ultimate Illusion, right? And so it was something that went on the absolute, edge.
Ultimate mythos?
Yeah, ultimate mythos, right? Yeah, and so it goes to that very edge of your imagination, right, and stretches your imagination. And what I think Final Fantasy has done to set those trends is create types of stories and settings and aesthetics, and do those things in such ways that you almost can't even look at other JRPGs without finding that inspiration about where they would go to find something that's visually unique, the types of settings that they would find. I mean, like, just take like Final Fantasy VIII, for example, right? Like before Final Fantasy VIII came out, you really couldn't find anything else that looked like that or that had that type of setting or anything else like that. And so Final Fantasy would always push, that kind of like D&D concept in ways that a lot of people wouldn't have really imagined, right? Even kind of like with Final Fantasy X, where Kitase said, well, when people think about fantasy, they think about, kind of medieval Europe, which is kind of ironic to think about now. But he said that, I wanted to take this to maybe a more Asian Pacific Islander setting rather than the types of European settings that people think of fantasy. And so I think
maybe that's what I feel like a game like Final Fantasy 16 is missing. I don't recall seeing a bunch of Japanese influenced stuff in 16, but that I have been able to, and basically
because it was trying to be like Game of Thrones.
Yes, but if you're gonna say something about Final Fantasy, something that's integral to Final Fantasy is being that cross of the cultures, the communion of the cultures of the West and the East, kind of.
Yeah.
I feel like 16 might have been missing that quite a bit.
I think that 16 did have that. Someone in the chat saying kaiju fights. I do think that 16 did have.
Good point.
Yeah,
Good point.
I do think that 16 did have the Japanese influence. And to my point, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about.
Gotcha.
I think that it's really just more about pushing that boundary. And I'm not saying that medieval setting is like bad or anything like that, by any means. I think that there is just really interesting ways that Final Fantasy tends to interpret things and that's what makes it interesting, right? Mm-hmm. And 14 also does that too, with a lot of its, like 14 setting never like, the setting in kind of like A Realm Reborn wasn't necessarily instantly appealing to me, but a lot of the settings that were introduced in like Stormblood and Shadowbringers and Endwalker, that's when I really started to be like, wow, I really love Final Fantasy XIV setting. There is a particular city, I don't want to spoil it for too many people, but there is a particular city in Shadowbringers, the last major city that you visit in Shadowbringers before the final boss. That was just like one of the most Final Fantasy moments ever. So Final Fantasy to me, I guess put simply, is stretching the imagination of the core principle of what role-playing games are, taking place in places and worlds that have never been seen before, or if they have been seen before, like, medieval settings, the interpretation of them is so fascinating and so different from anything else that you've ever seen. And I think it's within that space that Final Fantasy has really set trends and has been so influential, even in terms of fashion, stuff like fashion, like how, a lot of Nomura's designs have influenced JRPG aesthetics, because you look at the character designs, and the character designs are like nothing you could see. So Final Fantasy is all about this being as out there as possible while still retaining that core sort of Dungeons and Dragons role-playing philosophy.
Interesting.
Okay, so good things you brought up there, and I saw that one in the chat too, bringing up what about the trend chasing with Dungeons and Dragons, also Ultima and Wizardry. I'd like to kind of pivot from that point into another perspective on that. I think that's where it started for sure. Like there's no denying that, like, the first, maybe even second Final Fantasy were these guys who were young, really young, in their 20s, just out of college or having quit college to come work at this little startup game company trying to make something cool, and were largely kind of, borrowing from war simulation games they grew up with, Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop stuff, and then CRPGs like Wizardry and Ultima. However, I think right around the time of the third game is when Final Fantasy's spirit, like its own identity, really began to take shape. Right. It was, and from there forward up to a certain point, I think when I think about, again, like consistency within a brand, or what makes a thing what it is, I think one of the better analogies you can use is a foundation or a frame for a home, right? There's a lot of things people point to. In fact, there was another Yoshida quote where he said something like, Final Fantasy is the best story, the best graphics, the best gameplay, something like this, and then, of course, Chocobos and Moogles. And my thought on that is, well, I mean, maybe it's an attempt to dodge the question a little bit because it's unanswerable, and maybe he's just kind of having fun with it. But I just feel like that's so vague, because I mean, every game is trying to have the best story and the best gameplay it can possibly have, and the best graphical presentation it can go for, right? So, like, are we talking about a war simulation game? Are we talking about a shooter? Are we talking about a life sim? Or a farm sim? Are we talking about an RPG? Like, that can apply to all of those things. Right. And then, of course, what a lot of people point to, which is what I would equate to window dressing, Chocobos and Moogles. These specific job classes, they look like this. The sprites. Yeah. The sprites sort of set the the stage for that for FF3. And going back to the house analogy, like it's almost like saying these two houses are painted the same color and they have the same decor inside, so it's the same house, right? Like what I rarely see are people talking about the blueprint, talking about the foundation, talking about the framing of the thing, right? And it seems really clear to me, in fact, if anybody hasn't seen our FF8 podcast, this is where my thoughts on this really started to come together. FF8 was headed up by Yoshinori Kitase. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creative series, had really no creative hand in the creation of that game whatsoever. This was bred from, and I've got the magazine right over here where this interview came from. It was literally so blatant and so out of character for the interviews that I've read from these guys, mostly, where they really talk about how great the collaborative process was. They rarely talk about disagreements. But Sakaguchi and Kitase are pretty blunt on their disagreement on how Final Fantasy VIII shaped up.
Yeah, specifically that one. Yeah.
Like, Kitase really wanted to present the characters as proportioned, realistic, something more in the vein of like pushing the hardware towards more realism. And Sakaguchi was adamant about little squash deformed chibi dudes. He's like, is this really, you really think this is the best move? But there's another great interview with Satoru Iwata in one of his Iwata Asks interviews. And Tetsuya Takahashi was on there too, because they were talking about the release of the first Xenoblade and the last story at the time that those games were coming out. And what Sakaguchi said there was that he got this sense around the time of Final Fantasy VII's development that a lot of his junior developers were eager, really, really eager to do their own thing. They were tired of fulfilling his vision of Final Fantasy every single game. They wanted to do their own thing.
Of giving up their own will.
Yes.
Somebody else's will.
Yes. Are we starting to see where this theme started to be like the thing for every Final Fantasy? Okay. And so Tetsuya Takahashi, I mean, brilliant. Obviously, goes to make Xenogears. Freaking sweet game. I love that. He pitched that originally as a Final Fantasy VII, by the way, and it got rejected. Kitase goes on to make FF8. Sakaguchi goes on to make FF9 with a different team over here in like Hawaii. And then they've got Hiromichi Tanaka over here working on 11. And then Kitase goes on to, they started branching into teams. And we start seeing different blueprints. Different
There's
frames.
also Tactics, right? And
Final Fantasy Tactics with Matsuno, right? Yeah, a whole nother side of it. Different blueprint, different foundation, different frame, different house is what I'm coming to here, right? And this is where I think the confusion starts to come in, because you have somebody who comes in on, say, Final Fantasy VII, and I think you can really see some of the similarities to FF6 and FF7 and FF5. But like the further we go on, that frame and that foundation really begins to change in a very fundamental way. It's becoming a different video game genre over time. From the point where we are a Dungeons and Dragons inspired turn-based RPG over here to we are an action game over here 30 whatever years we are later, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything about whether that's a good or a bad thing. This is just my observation. I would love to get some feedback on this. I think what I'm really driving at here is that along the lines of what Ryan talked about in his video, if we're going to get any sort of clarity, if we're going to have this brand come into a place where people know what to expect from it, and then we can get rid of this tribal infighting and people like, we've got to pick a foundation and a frame and continue to iterate on that. Because as much as here are the two things that I really noticed ever changed in the classic Final Fantasy games: the setting, and they played and experimented with character progression. So how does the character level up? Combat was virtually the same, except they threw an ATB system in there for 5 games or something like that. Exploring the world, virtually the same. Like you're saying, Wade, a lot of the story's sort of baseline structure was more or less the same thing. There were so many things that kept them together as like, this is the same franchise. So how do you think, I'm now turning this back over to you guys, how does that become unified again? And what do you think is the best frame and foundation to pick moving forward? Or do you think, I like that we get into a different house every time. I think that's totally cool. I think a brand can be built on, we change our frame, we change our blueprint every time.
Well, to answer the first question, I think the identity problem that Final Fantasy is having right now is that people expect Final Fantasy to be good. And that's the issue. I don't think that there's any issue with what it references. I mean, the most Game of Thrones part of Final Fantasy XVI was the demo, and that is the most universally praised element of the game. It's
Sure.
It can be referential. It just has to be good. I don't mind that they took.
That's a great point.
I
Like
don't
we
think-
wouldn't be having this discussion if the
Absolutely
games
not.
were good.
Absolutely not. We wouldn't care that it's an action RPG. We
Nope,
wouldn't
we
care
wouldn't.
that Suzuki was involved if it weren't like. The issue with me for the game parts,
Can I cut in
specifically the
really,
Suzuki.
really quick? Can I cut in really, really quick? Because, and I'm not going to like counter this point right now because we're out of time. It's way too late. Maybe you and I can talk about this later.
Yeah.
But I find it strange that I don't know if any other franchise except Final Fantasy you could make that claim. Like if you turned Halo into like a freaking RPG and called it Halo 7, would that be accepted by anybody? Why is it?
Halo Wars was accepted.
Halo Wars.
You're right.
No, but that's not a mainline entry. That wasn't Halo 7. That wasn't Halo 6. That was Halo Wars. It was a spin-off. If we called Final Fantasy 16 Final Fantasy or what they did with Paradise, whatever the fetch thing.
Stranger Paradise, yeah.
Right. It's considered a spin-off. It's not considered Final Fantasy 16.
Yeah.
So if they made Halo 7 a freaking like turn-based RPG, I think people would, I would think rightly, be confused and disappointed in that. Like, why are you swapping our framework here? So why is it with Final Fantasy that we can have this argument and it seems like a legitimate thing to be able to even argue? But that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Because its identity was already tenuous. Like its identity has always been tenuous enough and always a moving target that we could get far enough away from. Like I firmly believe that if you were to compare 1 to 7, they are as dissimilar as 7 is to, say, 16.
I don't think that's true.
And that's fine. And that's fine. I think you could go even further. The thing that I think Final Fantasy evokes is quality. And I really do think that, hey, the creators of Final Fantasy want to make something really good. If it's really good, nobody is going to question the epistemology of Final Fantasy. Nobody is going to question the identity. The identity that they're searching for isn't the expectation that it fits within this brand. They want a good experience. And I think that's adequate. I think what we ended up getting here compared to, say, and this is again something where we would probably disagree on. I think 7R is a good example of something that really did do most of the things it was trying to do so well and get heavily deviant from its source material that nobody's confused about what that is. You know, nobody's confused that it's Final Fantasy. And
let me cut in with one more analogy,
Okay.
because I like where you're going with this.
yeah,
And then I swear I'm going to shut up for the rest of this podcast. So you're saying as long as it's good, right? Like that's all people really care about. What would you say your favorite restaurant in the world is? What's your favorite place to go eat? If you have one, or I don't know, pick 2. I don't care. Just what's your favorite place to eat?
the OG's Italian restaurant.
Okay, and what's your favorite dish at OG's?
They have a chicken carbonara.
Chicken carbonara. Okay, let's say. I mean, I'm sure they have a lot of other great stuff there, right? Do you tend to? Are you the kind of person that I go and I try different stuff every time, or do you stick to your thing? It's like I like this, I'm going to go get that dish. That's what I like.
I go for different stuff. I usually try something new every time.
Okay. So you try a different dish every time you go there. You never return the same stuff.
No, I'll return if I have dietary restrictions or something like that.
Okay, so this is a good distinction in personality too, because I know a lot of people who are that way. It's like I'm going to try something different every time I go, and then they're always disappointed. Why didn't I get that thing? I know I like, and I'm always like, just stick what you like. But the analogy where I'm going with this is, let's say your restaurant with your favorite dish takes that dish off the menu, and they replace it with, I don't know, this is an Italian restaurant. Let's say they replace it with like a bean burrito or something like that. Something outside of the scope of what that restaurant's identity is, right? And we say, oh, that's a really, really good bean burrito. You guys are gonna love it. It's so good. Like, as far as bean burritos go, like, bro, this one's awesome. It's like, that's fantastic. I liked, what was the dish that you liked? The chicken
carbonara.
Carbonara, yeah.
Carbonara. I want that dish, man. I liked the way you guys made that. The dish, the restaurant next door, they have one, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
I'm never going to get that one again. I want that one. Why can't you guys make that? They said, no. This bean burrito is great. So my counter to the point is it always just that it needs to be good? Or is there something more to it? I think I would be totally fine with what you're saying if Square Enix was still making a game with a framework like I'm talking about. But they don't.
I think there's enough in common, though. I think what you're saying is that you're trying to say that so much has fundamentally changed that it's now a burrito instead of, say, like, I don't know, a different protein. You know?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I think 16 is so different from FF1 through 9, let's call it, that it's a different dish entirely.
May I chime in?
There's common ancestry.
I just want to
chime
in.
Go ahead.
Because I think I could add something to the conversation really quickly.
Yeah, okay.
I think there is a condition in which you order something from your favorite restaurant, your favorite dish, and you get something else. And that is when they bring you something else and it's better than the thing that you thought was your favorite.
Okay.
You perceive it as better.
Sure.
The problem is,
what's the likelihood of that, though?
Yeah, exactly. That's extremely difficult to do.
It happens, but
that's extremely difficult to do. Now, when it comes to, if we want to talk about like Remake, for example, I actually really love that game's battle system. And actually, one of the things that I actually really like about that game's battle system, now storytelling is something else, but one of the things I really like about that game's battle system is that I feel like it kind of takes the base abstractions of Final Fantasy VII and using materia and the ATB system, and it creates a brand new way of presenting kind of like my favorite dish, right? And so even though I'm going to the restaurant and I'm ordering my favorite dish, they have brought out something in that specific instance that I found more enjoyable than the thing that I would have ordered. And so I'm completely okay with it. I'm actually delighted by it. It becomes the subversion, right? And the subversion works when, it's even greater than the thing that you were imagining or hoping for. And so I think that in particular is when it's awesome. So I think it's okay to bring out something, a better dish. But you got to make sure that it's a better dish, and making a better dish is really hard. But it's a lot easier when you're kind of using that dish, the previous dish, as a foundation for how you're making that better dish. And that's something that, like, say, Final Fantasy VII Remake's battle system does for me in comparison to the original.
Something really good, though, will redefine something for the zeitgeist. Definition is just common usage. And how you get to the top of the heap with common usage is through success. And like, I know Wade is like, as somebody like, I know that the ontologist and the epistemologist in the room are going like crazy right now. So I do want to give him a chance to like explain why things are defined the way that they are. But ultimately, it is up to the creators from a brand perspective. Like, hey, we get to decide what this is. Are we the only ones that do it? Well, whether that's a good move or not will be ultimately defined by how successful it is. And I'm telling you, if the DMC combat in Final Fantasy XVI would have been as good as DMC, and the RPG, like there are more RPG elements in God of War Ragnarok than there are in 16.
That's true.
And if that would have happened, if we would have had those elements and everybody would have resonated with them, if the game would have been difficult, like if it really would have been more than the sum of its parts, I don't think we would say, oh, Final Fantasy has an identity problem. We would say, this is the new identity of Final Fantasy. This is another notch on this ever-evolving brand, that gets to be new and interesting things. A better idea for look at any big franchise. What they're trying to do is make this a big franchise, and big franchises are built on their success. Star Trek, Star Wars, those things all have this really wide breadth of genres, and the things that define them the most are going to be the things that ultimately resonate with the most amount of people. That's my opinion. Wade, what you got to give me some ontological.
Yeah, I was going to pass it on to him because I've been wanting to hear what he has to say on this.
Yeah, I'm listening. I'm trying to absorb. It's difficult when what you determined were core elements of something ended up being interchangeable properties. And I think that is what many fans are realizing, that there was a misalignment between the things that they absolutely loved about the franchise and the things that the developers found to be critically core and elemental to the franchise. I'm old enough to remember that when Final Fantasy VII was revealed, there was a lot of hate. Of like, this is not medieval.
Steampunk, right?
This is steampunk. What is this? Yeah. And then it was released, and people were like, to Clark's point, this is good. We love this. And then Final Fantasy VIII came out, and people were like, where's Cloud, right? Why do we have a draw system,
Yeah, and nobody's dying.
Exactly. And so then Final Fantasy IX came out, and it's a return to medieval, and the people that really love 7, and even those that really liked 8, feel a little bit betrayed, even though it is arguably, according to Sakaguchi and others, maybe the best Final Fantasy that's out there.
Or at least the most in line, yeah.
Or at least the most in line.
I would agree with that.
It's also important, I think, to understand that each one of these is a different iteration of the evolution of the series. So chocobos come into play in Final Fantasy II, but Final Fantasy I doesn't have chocobos, right? And so you can't necessarily say that all Final Fantasies have chocobos, but today that's a mainstay. In the same way, I think in terms of like, we get these epic battle scenes in the early Final Fantasies and in Final Fantasy VII and all this kind of stuff. And as a child, as a kid, I imagined what would it have been like, not to, as my brother says, to fight through lists and menus, right? To actually take the sword, right? Because my brother, he's a big Call of Duty fan, reviled by my followers on Twitter, right? And he looked at 16 and said, this looks like Call of Duty. Now, he was so wrong about that, right? Like, there's so many other genres and franchises that he could have said, but he was like, this looks like something that I would play. His whole framework was not about the stories, but it was about me going through lists to select Fire 3 or whatever. And so I think that Square Enix was like, if I were to kind of think through their evolutionary process, it's like, how do we give people the richness that this franchise offers at the core without the obstacles that technology in the past and gameplay design would have done? Now, evolutionary thought and theory means that there are going to be some iterations that just don't work. But we wouldn't have Final Fantasy XVI without Final Fantasy VIII, right? And each one of those created something else, or 10 for that matter. I mean, the advent of voice acting in that respect. And I think that we see what 16 is, and we also understand what it does well, but where is it going to lead for Final Fantasy 17? When it comes to naming specific pieces, and I mentioned this in my video, but to Clark's point about ontology, you have to have those core elements and those core properties. It is heartbreaking, like I began, for someone to recognize what I loved about this series was not core to it.
Right, it was an interchangeable property.
It was an interchangeable property. Same thing with Zelda. I think somebody said in the chat, the very first Zelda was like an open world. Breath of the Wild is maybe truer to that format than certainly Zelda 2 was, which is largely reviled because it changed up the system. But then it kind of riffs on the Ocarina of Time and Link to the Past sort of thing. So again, what was core about that series, the elements and the interchangeable properties. So that's all that I would say.
No, I think these are all great points, and I appreciate you guys sharing.
Yeah,
I had one thought in terms of all of this, and it is: does anyone have any semblance of an idea of what Final Fantasy XVII might be?
No, but I have said Edo era Japan is where they need to go next.
But do you know what Dragon Quest 12 is probably going to be, right? You get a pretty good idea of what Dragon Quest 12 is going to be.
No,
kind of not actually, because they've been saying that Dragon Quest 12 is going to be quite different.
Okay, besides what people are saying, I'm talking about from a brand management perspective. I'm not talking about what
if we're talking about like based on like 1 through 11, yeah, you could have a
based on every single Dragon Quest ever,
right?
You got a pretty good idea of what the next one's going to be.
Right.
Whether that holds true, I know that's different. But for
Right.
Final Fantasy 17, the fact that nobody has any clue, like setting, gameplay style, like any single thing about the entire game, except maybe we might kill God in the end. That's it. Like that means that what is Final Fantasy, and that's the deeper question. You should have some idea of what 17 might hold for you, if there was any core to what Final Fantasy has become now.
Right. I do want to say one thing, kind of in response to what Wade and Clark have said, which I think they both have really fantastic points, and points that I don't necessarily disagree with. But for me, it's kind of a matter of the approach to it, right? Because I agree that, yes, like with example with Zelda, you do have, some Zelda fans quite jaded that the Breath of the Wild style is going to be the new thing going forward. However, Breath of the Wild has sold 30 million units, and the biggest selling traditional Zelda has sold 8 million units, and therefore the new fans are so much more louder than the old fans that if you're an old fan, that's too bad, buddy. It's the same case with Final Fantasy VII. A lot of people didn't like that we were going from the more traditional medieval fantasy settings to the steampunk setting that Final Fantasy VII is. However, Final Fantasy VII sold 14 million units, and the other games did not even come close to selling that, and the new fans replaced it. So Clark's absolutely right. I believe that as long as, and this goes back to the restaurant analogy too, as long as the thing that you thought you were ordering,
that it goes on top of the new version of the dish,
right,
and makes it better,
right, and as long as you present what I think that if we're going to evolve a series gameplay-wise, I do think that you have to start from what are the feelings and what's achieved from that game. And that's why I think that an evolution like Resident Evil 2 and 3 to Resident Evil 4, Ocarina of Time to Twilight Princess to Breath of the Wild works. I mean, why Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time works, because there's quite a big difference between
God of War 3 to God of War Reboot works.
Yeah, exactly. Or why, and why Final Fantasy VII Originals gameplay to Final Fantasy VII Remakes works. Or Mario World to Mario 64 works, because even though those games are mechanically different, they approach the same feelings and sensations, and they give you them there, but they do it from a different angle. And that's where you can change your gameplay, and people can still have consensus that this is a thing within the same franchise, and it can even reach a new level of audience. However, where I think my perspective really kind of differs maybe a little bit from Clark and Wade is that it's the approach to how you make that good thing. And I am a firm believer in iteration because, for example, do you guys think Bethesda could make a good Devil May Cry? Maybe, right? But their first attempt at it, their first attempt at it would probably be pretty rough, right? Similar to, I mean, even FF1 being like a Dungeons and Dragon clone, and it would not be that great, right?
I mean, From Software's first RPG was Dark Souls, and it was great. I think it's a dice roll. It really is, whether somebody can enter something and do something.
Isn't it Demon Souls?
Demon Souls, I mean. I'm sorry.
Right. No, and I think
I'm sorry, From Soft friends.
Right.
I just want to make sure.
Right.
I love you.
What wasn't Kingsfield? Was that an RPG, or was that like?
I don't know.
I never played Kingsfield, so I'm just not sure.
I actually don't know.
And my counter argument would be, though, is that they have stuck with a lot of principles introduced in that first Souls game all the way through Elden Ring, and improved on them and made them better. And then we got to Elden Ring, then we got to Bloodborne and Sekiro, right?
As soon as we take those things out, we're going to be a no man.
Right. Yeah. And so are they gonna put out Demon Souls, and then are they gonna put out like something else that's on par with Demon Soul that revolutionizes something? And so, yes, you can come out of the gate and be really good at something.
It's harder though.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Harder.
And can you come out of the gate with something?
Well, they call it lightning in a bottle for a reason.
Yeah, right. Can you come out of the gate with something as good as Demon Souls that's brand new and has absolutely nothing to do with Demon Souls every single time you approach creating a game? I cannot name a single studio that does that. I cannot name a human being that really does that with their art. Okay, kind of Annapurna. Okay, you're kind of cooking there. Annapurna does do that, but
24 video games.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy XVII is going to be a banger action game, if what you're saying is true.
Right. Well, if it builds off of 16 and 7R, right? It will be.
And that is kind of to your point. I don't know if you said this at the beginning of the stream or before, but I do think that I agree with you in saying that they need to pick a lane to some degree and to iterate within that lane. And so say for 7 Rebirth, I think that the combat in that is going to be spectacular because it iterates on something that was already good. Remake had good combat, and I think it's going to be near universally praised because they've been able to master it and iterate on top of that. Moving forward.
Yeah. If they, absolutely. If they change that, I'd be like, okay,
it's over
here. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we can't delay Wade any longer from getting to his own stream here. We're way more than an hour over where we said we're going to go. I will say this as my last piece, and then we will probably talk about this again at some future point, I hope. I think all the points made were really good. I'll definitely be watching this podcast again myself and kind of returning to stuff.
Yeah.
I just want to say, as much as I agree on the points, particularly with FF7 and 6, actually, 6 even more as well, before, did some of the things you guys are talking about in taking a direction. And I like the way you put it, Wade, where you thought a core element ended up not being a core element or something.
An interchangeable, yeah.
And it was an interchangeable thing.
What you thought was a core.
Yeah, that can kind of cause some, I don't know, cognitive dissonance with people.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do sympathize because somebody came in and said, well, what about Resident Evil 4 or some of these other games that had God of War was brought up too. While I liked Resident Evil 4 way better than the original 1, 2, and 3 games, I sympathize with those people who miss the less action and the real hardcore focus on the on the item preservation. You can only save a certain amount of times in the game, and like there's a whole strategy to all of that is lost. That's true. And some people aren't gonna like the new dish, even if it is great like the old one. Yeah. And I sympathize for those people. And so I guess my point in the end is I've been on both sides of this argument in different situations.
Yeah.
And I really can kind of like, I can relate to both.
Yeah.
And so there is really no answer to this question. And I know that there isn't, but it is an interesting thing nevertheless to talk about, because it just shows how many different ways people can see a thing. And ultimately, like, what it means to you is more important than what it means to other people, and just go with what you what resonates with you. And if it's not resonating with you anymore, that's fine.
L3
let it go.
R3 to accept the truth.
Let it go. Accept the truth.
Find a new restaurant.
Find a new restaurant. It's not that hard. All right. Anything else you guys want to say before we peace out?
This is fun.
This was
this was
extreme honor to finally talk to you in this capacity.
Yeah,
we'll do it again.
I love this.
We'll do it again.
Have me on anytime. Yeah, for sure.
One of these days, I'm going to be building a new podcast studio, and it'll actually be in my new place I'm moving into. And the plan is to get some people in person with us. We have some plans for this, so
would love that.
We'll elaborate more on that here in the coming months. But I'd love to actually meet some of you guys in person one of these days. Instead of just doing this Discord.
I got to meet these two in person.
We've all met each other. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Thanks to Final Fantasy XVI, actually. Yeah, because we were at the launch party.
Launch party in LA.
Yeah.
Oh, who all were all three of you guys there?
I threw a weird
nice.
party. Yeah.
Well, you did the after party thing, right, Clark? You hosted
It was like a pre-party. Yeah.
Oh, a pre-party. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, guys, thanks for coming on. Wade, I might jump over and watch your stream here for a bit. Everybody else should do it if you've got time. It's going to be late, but check it out.
It's the kickoff. We're doing the prologue, which arguably is the best part of the game. So
there you go. All right, guys. Talk to you later. Thanks.
See ya.
Peace out.
See you guys.